Hey everyone. Welcome back to Fiction Moon. Get ready for an amazing tale. What if Harry unlocked a forbidden soul archive at age 7 and found Dumbledore had sold his destiny? Smash that like button and subscribe for more. Here we go. Chapter 1, The space between the stairs. The cupboard smelled like dust and old socks and the particular kind of darkness that collects in places nobody loves. Harry had lived in it for as long as he could remember. 3 steps deep, slanted ceiling that caught the top of his head if he forgot to duck, one bare bulb on a pull string that Uncle Vernon had unscrewed the previous Tuesday as punishment for something Harry had done or hadn't done or had simply existed too loudly in the vicinity of. The details never really mattered with Vernon. The punishment was the point. Tonight's offense was spectacular, at least by Privet Drive standards. Harry had been in the garden when Mrs. Figg's cat, Mr. Tibbles, had gotten himself stuck up the old oak that pressed against the garden wall. Harry hadn't meant to help. Or rather, he hadn't meant to help in the way that he did. One moment he was watching the orange tabby yowl from a branch 12 feet up, the next the branch had gently, almost tenderly, bent itself down to garden level and deposited Mr. Tibbles onto the grass like a package being delivered. Mrs. Figg had seen. She'd made a noise like a kettle. Uncle Vernon had been called. So. The cupboard. 3 days. No meals except what Dudley decided not to finish, which historically meant whatever had gone cold or been sneezed on. Harry was 7 years old and he was used to it. He sat in the dark with his knees pulled to his chest and his back against the wall that separated him from the kitchen, listening to the television through it, some game show where people won cars, the audience noise coming through the plaster in a thin wash of distant happiness. Dudley was probably on the sofa. Aunt Petunia was probably cleaning something that wasn't dirty. The house ran its routines without him and the world didn't notice, and Harry had learned a long time ago that there was no use getting upset about the things that were simply true. What he could not explain, even to himself, was why the wall behind him felt different tonight. Not different in a frightening way. Different the way a door feels when you've been looking at it as wallpaper for years and then one day you realize it actually opens. He turned around slowly in the cramped dark. Pressed his palm flat against the plaster. It was cool under his hand, ordinary plaster, and then, not. There was something on the other side of ordinary. A warmth, a depth, the faint suggestion of a space that shouldn't fit in the architecture of number 4, Privet Drive, because the wall backed onto the kitchen and Harry could hear the refrigerator hum through it and knew exactly how much space was on the other side. None. There was no space on the other side. And yet. He pressed harder. The wall didn't push back. It pulled him in. Not physically, he didn't move an inch in the cupboard, didn't tip forward, didn't go anywhere his body could verify. But something in him leaned, and the wall received that lean, and the dark of the cupboard slid sideways like a curtain drawn aside by an unhurried hand, and Harry was somewhere else. He stood in a library that had no ceiling. That was the first thing he understood, that the space above him went up without ending, not in the way of a tall room but in the way of sky, shelves rising in columns so high they blurred into luminescence, thousands and thousands of books arranged in no order Harry could parse, some bound in deep red, some in black so absolute it seemed to eat the light around it, some wrapped in materials he had no name for, things that shifted like oil on water, things that were thin as a held breath. Things that looked almost like skin. The floor was glass, or something that behaved like glass, and beneath it Harry could see figures moving, dark silhouettes passing through deeper dark, purposeful and slow, going somewhere he couldn't follow with his eyes. He stepped carefully. The floor held. The air tasted like paper and copper and something ancient that Harry associated with the old church misses. Fig had taken him to once, that stone and candle and history smell that made you feel like you were standing in the middle of a very long sentence. He walked between the shelves. The books didn't have titles on their spines. They had names. He passed Aberforth Dumbledore, thick, dark green, bristling with bookmarked pages, and Arabella Figg, slim, lavender, well-worn at the edges. He passed an entire shelf labeled with names he didn't recognize, foreign names, names in scripts he couldn't read, and a section where the books were so small they were nearly invisible, spine width of a finger, some of them the width of a breath. He found his own name without looking for it. It was just there, at chest height, on a shelf to his left, as if it had been waiting at exactly the level a 7-year-old would encounter it. Harry James Potter. The binding was the color of old gold, or new blood, depending on the angle, and it was thicker than he'd expected, much thicker than the slim lives next to it, thicker even than the Arabella Fig book, thick as a dictionary, heavy with everything that was supposed to happen to him. He took it off the shelf. It opened on its own. Not violently, not with a flourish. Just, opened, the way a book opens when it's been waiting a long time to be read and can't quite help itself. The first pages were his history. His birth, James Fleamont Potter and Lily Juniper Potter, née Evans, present. Magic registered at birth, category extraordinary, classification unrestricted. He didn't know what that meant but he filed it. His parents' names. He read them twice. Said them quietly in the dark. James. Lily. They didn't feel like strangers when written down like that. They felt like people who had existed with a kind of precision, like they'd been real in a very specific way. He turned pages. His early childhood. His arrival at Privet Drive, there were annotations here, in cramped blue ink handwriting in the margin, and something about those annotations made Harry's chest do something complicated, because the handwriting was deliberate and authoritative and clearly belonged to someone who had made a decision and wanted the archive to know they stood behind it. Placed at number 4, Privet Drive, Surrey. Blood ward established. Emotional development, acceptable loss. Long-term strategic necessity confirmed. Signed, below, APWB Dumbledore. Harry read that 3 times. Acceptable loss. He wasn't sure he understood all the words the way adults understood them, but he understood what the phrase was doing, what it was smoothing over, what it was reclassifying. He was the loss being deemed acceptable. He kept reading. The contract was in the middle of the book, on pages that were different from the rest, heavier, colder, edged in something silver that wasn't quite ink. It was written in a language Harry had never seen and somehow could read perfectly, the way you can understand something in a dream without being told what it means. It described him. What he was supposed to do, what would be required of him, what he was promised in exchange. Except the exchange column was mostly blank on his side. The things promised to Harry were thin, vague, deliberately unspecified. A chance at survival. The possibility of a normal life, contingent on everything going right for everyone else first. The signature at the bottom of the contract was not just Dumbledore's. There were 3 others, in scripts that shifted when he looked at them directly, easier to read in his peripheral vision, the signatures of entities he had no frame of reference for, except that the archive seemed to hum differently near their names, a lower, more resonant frequency, as if the space itself recognized their authority. Below the contract, in a separate section, transaction date. Transaction terms. Brokerage fee paid in, future unrealized potential of the secondary party. Secondary party, that was him. Harry. They had used the future he hadn't had yet as currency. He sat down on the glass floor. The figures moved beneath him, unhurried. He thought about it. He didn't cry. He'd stopped crying about things he couldn't immediately fix when he was about 5, after he'd understood that tears in the cupboard only made his face itch and the dark wasn't going to feel sorry for him. This felt like the same principle, enlarged. He turned the fact over, someone had sold his future before he'd had a chance to live it. Someone had decided, with a pen and a signature and the authority of someone who thought they understood what the world needed, that Harry's choices were a reasonable price to pay. He thought, all right. Then I need to understand the rules. He went back to the beginning of the book. He read for what felt like hours. The archive didn't rush him. The light was sourceless and steady, neither warm nor cold, the kind of light that existed to serve the reading and nothing else. He read his own fate threads, the word the archive used for the projected lines of probable futures, each one branching from decision points, some thick and bright, some thin and fraying, some already snipped close to their origins and tied off. He read the annotations. He read the footnotes. He cross-referenced his entry against his parents' books, which pulled themselves from their respective shelves when he thought about them clearly enough, which told him the archive was responsive, which was important to know. His parents' contracts were adjacent to his, the pages physically connected, a thin thread of the silver-edged material running between all three books like a spine within the spine. Their contract was different from his. It was older, written under different terms, and at its conclusion there was a clause that Dumbledore's annotations in Harry's book didn't mention at all. In consideration of the sacrifice freely given, the secondary beneficiary, H.J. Potter, shall be released from all transactional obligations upon reaching majority. All fate threads to revert to sovereign ownership of the named party. Harry read that 3 times too. Then he read it a fourth, slowly. His parents had made a deal. Their deaths, or their willingness to die, which wasn't quite the same thing the archive seemed to feel, had terms. And one of the terms was that Harry would eventually be free. That the contract placed on him had a release clause written in by James and Lily themselves, presumably because they'd known what was being asked, had understood the transaction, and had insisted on at least that much. And Dumbledore's annotations didn't mention it. Not once. Not in passing. He'd written around it, over it, made decisions that treated it as if it didn't exist. Harry closed his father's book carefully. His mother's. His own. He sat for another long moment on the glass floor in the library without a ceiling. Then he stood up, replaced the books precisely as he'd found them, and let the archive return him to the cupboard, which smelled like dust and old socks and which now felt substantially smaller than it had an hour ago. Not in a suffocating way. In the way of something that had served its purpose and could be outgrown. He lay down on his cot in the dark and stared up at the slanted ceiling and thought, I have time. I have 4 years before any of this starts. I should use them. He closed his eyes. He didn't sleep for a while, but when he did, it was deep and dreamless and very, very deliberate. Over the next 3 days in the cupboard, Harry returned to the archive each night. He was methodical about it. The first night he'd been surprised into understanding, the second night he was a student. He started at the archive's outer edges, the shelves furthest from his own book, trying to understand the geography of the place. It was organized in ways that became clearer with repeated exposure, not alphabetically, not chronologically, but by significance, a term the archive seemed to assign by some internal calculus involving magical weight, historical impact, and what Harry could only describe as loudness, the degree to which a given soul's choices had caused ripples. The loudest shelves in the archive, the ones that practically vibrated, were a long row near what Harry thought of as the archive center. He walked that row slowly. Saw names he didn't recognize yet. Saw Tom Marvolo Riddle in a binding that was black shot through with silver and damaged at one corner, the spine cracked, the pages dense with notation. He didn't open that one, something about the way the archive's hum changed near it warned him off. Not with fear exactly but with the instinct that some contextual groundwork was needed before he went wading in. He noted the location. Filed it. He found something more immediately interesting on his third visit, a secondary shelf, lower, attached to the main stacks by a thin iron bracket, containing books that were thinner and in different bindings from the primary ledgers. These were labeled not with names but with covenant records, the transactions themselves, stripped of personal history, existing as pure contractual objects. The archive had a filing system for its own business. He pulled the one dated to his birth year. It was slim, copper-covered, and open to the record he'd already found in his own ledger, but here it was stripped of Dumbledore's personal annotations and rendered in the archive's neutral voice, which was more precise and considerably more damning. The fee was described in detail, the margin notes had softened. The architect's role was made explicit, they had approached Dumbledore, not the other way around. They had come with a proposal. He had accepted it, but the initiative had been theirs. Harry sat with that for a while. The picture wasn't simple. It was never going to be simple. The architects, three entities, named in the contract by titles rather than personal names, the registrar, the executor, the witness, had identified Harry's potential before he'd been born. They'd quantified the extraordinary, unrestricted classification from his first magical expression as an infant and decided it had value on a scale that made brokering a soul contract profitable for them. They'd approached the one man who had both the authority and the desperation to agree. Dumbledore had needed a solution to the Voldemort problem that didn't cost more than he was willing to pay personally. And Harry had been willing to pay by virtue of being 7 years old and not yet born when they'd made the decision for him. Harry replaced the Covenant record on its shelf. He looked at the rows of them, decades of transactions, centuries, probably. Thousands of people whose futures had been altered, optimized, sold, or voided without their knowledge. He thought about the figures moving under the glass floor, purposeful and slow. He wondered if any of them had ever fought back. He found, on the fourth shelf over, a small section of Covenant records that were bound differently, their spines stamped with a word in the shifting script that resolved, when he tilted his head, as voided. These were contracts that had been dissolved. He counted them. 11, from the dates, about 600 years of records. 11 out of what appeared to be thousands. He pulled all 11. He sat down on the floor and read them. Each dissolution was different. Some had been voided on technicalities, improperly signed, witnessed incorrectly, filed after the contractual deadline. Some had been voided by the death of all parties before the contract could be executed. Only two, had been voided by what the archive described as successful counterargument before the full covenant, resulting in a finding of undue influence. He read those 2-3 times. Counterargument. Before the full covenant. Meaning, you could argue your way out. The architects held courts. They had procedures. They believed in their own legal framework enough to abide by it when challenged properly. Harry filed that away too, in the place in his mind that was growing crowded with useful things. When Vernon opened the cupboard door on the fourth morning, Harry came out with a calm, settled expression that made Vernon blink and look uncomfortable without being able to articulate why. He ate his breakfast, Dudley's cold toast, and went to school and sat in his classroom, and while Mrs. Henderson talked about multiplication he thought about 11 voided contracts and 2 of them won by argument, and he decided that the first thing he needed, before anything else, was an education sufficient to make the argument that would free him. Which meant he had 4 years to become the best student Privet Drive Primary School had ever produced. He raised his hand and answered Mrs. Henderson's next 3 questions correctly, and she looked so startled she nearly dropped her chalk. The years between 7 and 11 were not the years of a neglected, confused boy waiting to be told he was special. They were the years of a boy who already knew and was working backward from the knowledge. He read everything he could get his hands on, school library, the Oxfam bookshop on the high street where books were 30 pence and Mrs. Polwheel the volunteer let him stay until closing, Mrs. Figg's front room which contained 2 entire walls of books in categories he'd never encountered, including a whole shelf on folklore and mythology and magical history that Harry read with the concentrated attention of a scholar who suspects fiction of containing evidence. He visited the archive regularly. Not every night. He'd learned on the 5th visit that the archive monitored its own traffic, that his visits were recorded in the margins of his own ledger in a small, mechanical shorthand, and that overuse created a notation suggesting destabilization risk. He didn't know exactly what that meant and wasn't willing to risk it. Once a week was his rule. Enough to learn, not enough to flag. He mapped the archive over those 4 years the way a cartographer maps a continent, patient, methodical, building a picture one observation at a time. He learned that the architects were not present in the archive itself, they existed outside it, in a space the archive referenced but did not contain. He learned that the archive had no physical form in the world, it existed in the space his parents' sacrifice had created, which meant it was tethered to him, powered by the same magic that lived in his blood and the wards of Privet Drive. He was both its key and its keeper. He learned that Dumbledore visited it. That was the discovery at age 9 that changed his planning considerably. He'd been checking the Covenant Records section when he noticed a set of recent annotations in the margin of one of the older contracts, not his, but adjacent to his, a secondary record he didn't immediately recognize as significant. The handwriting was the same cramped blue ink from his own ledger. Recent. Within the year. Dumbledore was still monitoring the contract. Still checking in. Still, as far as Harry could tell, managing it, making small adjustments in the annotation margins, the kind of adjustments that didn't change the terms but changed the way the terms would be read when the time came. Narrative management. He was shaping the story the archive would tell. Harry copied every annotation carefully in a school exercise book that he kept inside his pillowcase, and he began to think about Hogwarts. Because Hogwarts was where the physical anchor had to be. The archive had a spiritual presence here, under the cupboard, drawn by the Blood Ward's power, but its contractual center, the place where the documents had real-world weight, had to be somewhere with more magical infrastructure. The contract predated Privet Drive. It predated Harry's birth. The architects operated on a scale that needed anchoring in old magic, deep-rooted magic, the kind of magic that had been layered over centuries in a single location. The only place in Britain with that kind of magical depth, as far as Harry could determine from 4 years of reading, was Hogwarts. He needed to get there. He needed to find the anchor. And then he needed, very carefully, very precisely, to take it apart. He turned 11 and waited for his letter with the patience of someone who already knew it was coming but had enough respect for the drama of it not to hurry it along. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which seemed anticlimactic. Harry collected it from the hall floor before Vernon woke up, read it in the kitchen over toast, put it back in its envelope, and waited. What followed was the predictable chaos of Vernon attempting to outrun the postal system while the postal system proved itself categorically impossible to outrun. Harry watched the escalating letter delivery situation with detached interest, as a scientist might observe a natural process he'd already understood theoretically. The hundreds of letters were impressive, he admitted. The archive had referenced Hogwarts acceptance protocols as essentially unstoppable. Once the castle decided you were coming, but seeing it in action had an elegance he appreciated. Hagrid arriving through the door of a hut on a rock in the middle of the sea on Harry's birthday was the kind of thing that would have felt like magic to a boy who hadn't spent 4 years in a soul archive. To Harry it felt like the opening move of a game he'd been studying in preparation for years. He liked Hagrid immediately and completely. There was nothing complicated about Hagrid, which was enormously restful. He was large and kind and incapable of effective deception, and he clearly thought the world of Harry in a straightforward way that asked nothing back. Harry appreciated that. "Did ya ever make anything happen?" Hagrid asked, after explaining that Harry was a wizard in the uncomplicated way only Hagrid could. "Anything you couldn't explain?" "The branch," Harry said. "With Mr. Tibbles. When I was 7. Hagrid's eyes went wide. "Yeah, remember that?" "I remember everything from when I was 7, Harry said. Which was true. The archive had sharpened his memory the way a whetstone sharpens a blade. Each visit laid new grooves of recollection, and after 4 years of practice he could recall the text of archive entries he'd read once at age 8 with near-perfect fidelity. "Can I ask you something?" "Course. Does Dumbledore know I'm coming to Hogwarts? Did he have to do anything to make it happen?" Hagrid paused with the bent poker he'd been using to light the fire still in his hand. The pause was longer than it should have been. "Well, Dumbledore's the headmaster, so he'd know all the, did he do anything specific?" Harry said, pleasantly. "To ensure I'd be placed at Hogwarts. Rather than somewhere else. Or homeschooled. Or trained privately." The pause this time was longer enough to be an answer. "You're a smart kid," Hagrid said finally, in a voice that sounded like he wasn't sure that was uncomplicated good news. "I'm a very smart kid," Harry agreed. "That's not Hagrid's fault and I'm not angry about it. Can we go to Diagon Alley?" Hagrid looked at him for a moment longer, something shifting behind his beetle-black eyes, not quite suspicion, more like the recognition of depth where he'd expected shallows. Then he grinned, and the grin was genuine and wide and knocked the concern off his face entirely. "Yeah," he said. "Let's go." Diagon Alley was, by any objective measure, wonderful. Harry had read about it, had found references to the magical commerce district in two of Mrs. Figg's folklore books, which had discussed it in the oblique, embarrassed way of texts written by people who technically believed and technically didn't. The reality was substantially better than the reference material. He walked through it with Hagrid's enormous hand on his shoulder and his eyes moving constantly, cataloging, filing. He bought his school supplies with the strange, light feeling of someone spending money they hadn't known they had on things they'd known they'd need. His parents' vault was deeper than Hagrid seemed to expect. Harry caught the small surprised double-take the half-giant did when the goblin opened the door, and Harry thought, the brokerage fee. What the architects had taken in future potential, they'd somehow left the financial equivalent of in Gringotts. He didn't know if that was a coincidence or a clause, but he intended to find out. Ollivander's was the last stop. The shop was narrow and dust-moted, and Mr. Ollivander himself was the most precisely observant person Harry had encountered outside of the archive. He measured Harry in 11 places simultaneously without seeming to measure at all, watching Harry's face the whole time with those pale, full-moon eyes, and when Harry met the look steadily the old wand-maker went very still for a moment. "Curious," Ollivander said. "What is?" "Most children look around the shop when I measure them. They're distracted by the environment. You've been looking at me." He tilted his head. "You have the look of someone who is assessing whether I'm trustworthy." "Are you?" Ollivander smiled, slow and strange. "I am neutral. Which is a different thing, and perhaps more useful." He turned to his shelves. "Holly and phoenix feather. 11 inches. Pliable." He offered the wand. Harry picked it up. The warmth that coursed up his arm was familiar, not new, but recognized, like meeting someone he'd known as a description and was now meeting in person. The archive had mentioned a wand in the fate threads. He'd wondered about it. Now he knew, it was less a tool and more a voice. Something in the wood and feather recognized something in him, and the recognition was mutual. He gave it a wave. Gold and red sparks fell from the tip like a held breath finally released. "Curious indeed," Ollivander murmured. "The phoenix whose feather is in your wand gave one other feather. Just one other. It is curious that you should be destined for this wand when its brother gave Voldemort his wand," Harry said. Ollivander went very still. "I know. It's in the records." Ollivander stared at him. Harry smiled. "Thank you for the wand, Mr. Ollivander. I think we'll work well together." He paid and walked out and found Hagrid waiting outside in the late afternoon alley sun looking faintly overwhelmed, and Harry felt, for the first time in 4 years of careful planning, something close to excitement. Not the wild, helpless excitement of a child. Something cleaner than that. The feeling of a long preparation meeting the moment it was designed for. "All set?" Hagrid asked. "Nearly," Harry said. "I just need to buy a journal. There's a stationer's back there." "What fare?" Harry thought about 11 voided contracts, 2 of them won by argument, and the annotation he'd copied at age 9 in a school exercise book inside a pillowcase, and the look on Dumbledore's face when he eventually realized that Harry had been reading the same archive he'd been managing for a decade. "Notes," Harry said simply, and went to buy the journal. King's Cross was on a grey September morning that smelled of iron and distance. Harry found the barrier between platforms 9 and 10 without assistance. He'd read enough about it to locate it by the specific quality of the magical resonance in the area, a hum he'd learned to notice in the same way he'd learned to navigate the archive, by feel more than sight, and went through it with his trolley at a deliberate, unhurried walk. The Hogwarts Express was red and enormous and breathing steam. The platform was packed with families saying goodbye in all the ways families do, some complicated, some simple, some barely looking at each other and some barely able to let go. Harry loaded his trunk, found an empty compartment, put Hedwig's cage on the rack, and sat down. He opened his new journal to the first page and wrote, in his neatest handwriting, "Things I know. Things I need to know. Things I need to do." He drew 3 columns and began filling them in. The first column was considerably longer than the others. The door of the compartment slid open. A girl with wild brown hair and a stack of books she was clearly struggling to manage stepped halfway in, looked at the single occupant, and said, with the directness of someone who'd already decided on an approach, "Is this compartment taken? Every other one has people who look like they're going to want to talk about themselves for the entire journey, and I need to read, and you look like you might be actually interesting." Harry looked up from his journal. He considered her. Bright eyes, watchful, the kind of energy that comes from someone who has spent a lot of time being the most prepared person in any room and has learned to carry it without apology. "It's not taken," he said. "Sit down. I'm Harry." "Hermione," she said, already maneuvering the books through the door. "What are you writing?" "A list." "What kind?" Harry looked at the 3 columns. "Things I know. Things I need to know. Things I need to do." He considered how much to say to a girl he'd met 11 seconds ago, and then considered what the archive had taught him about acting from fear of disclosure versus acting from strategic judgment, and decided that the instinct to tell her something real was, on this occasion, worth trusting. "It's a research plan," he said. "I found something when I was 7. I've been working out what to do about it ever since." Hermione sat down with her books in her lap and studied him with eyes that were, Harry noticed, doing exactly what Ollivanders had done, measuring, assessing, deciding. "What did you find?" she asked. Harry looked out the window as the train began to move. London sliding away, replaced by the less certain geography of what came next. "Evidence," he said. Hermione was quiet for a moment. "Then, evidence of what?" The train picked up speed. The city fell behind them. "That my future was sold," Harry said, "before I was born. And I'm going to get it back." Hermione opened her mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. "Tell me everything," she said. So he did. Not all of it, there wasn't time before Hogwarts for all of it, and Harry had learned to calibrate disclosure the way you calibrate anything important, enough to be honest, not so much that you lose the shape of what you're trying to say. He told her the archive existed. He told her what it was. He told her about the contract, about Dumbledore's signature, about his parents' release clause and the 11 voided records and the 2 won by argument. He watched her face as he talked and watched it do something extraordinary. Most people's faces, when given information that destabilizes their understanding of reality, go through several stages of resistance before arriving at consideration. Hermione's face went from surprise directly to working on it, the resistance phase apparently absent, and he felt something click into place that he hadn't known was unlatched. "The release clause," she said, when he'd finished. "Your parents wrote it into the original contract. Which means the architects accepted it as a valid term." "Yes. Which means they're legally bound by it. Regardless of Dumbledore's annotations." "That's my reading, yes. And Dumbledore has been suppressing awareness of that clause. Deliberately and consistently for at least a decade." She was quiet again, this time with the quality of silence that is actually very loud thinking. "What do you need from Hogwarts specifically?" she asked. "The contract's physical anchor. It's somewhere in the castle. I need to locate and examine it. And I need access to the school's restricted library section on magical law and covenant theory, which I assume they have because Hogwarts is the kind of place that keeps the dangerous books closest." "The restricted section," Hermione said, and something in her voice suggested she'd already been thinking about this. "I read about it. You need a teacher's note for general access, but there's a subsection on contract law that might be under separate protections." "How do you know about the subsection?" "I read the Hogwarts school charter on the train coming here," she said, matter-of-factly, and held up one of the books she'd been carrying, not a school textbook, Harry saw, but a slim-bound pamphlet that said Hogwarts, A Magical History, Abridged Administrative Edition, on the cover. It lists the library's organization in an appendix. Appendix C, specifically. I thought it would be useful. Harry looked at her. Something that had been building for 4 years of solitary planning found, in this girl on this train, its first external foothold. Hermione, he said. Yes. I think you might be the most useful person I've ever met. She looked briefly startled, and then pleased, and then successfully suppressed the pleased into something that tried to be academic. Well, she said. I do try to be thorough. Outside, England slid past, green and unhurried, and the Hogwarts Express carried them north toward a school that was also, though neither of them had been told this, a vault, holding in its deep stones the paperwork of a transaction that would determine whether Harry Potter lived as his parents had intended, or died in the service of someone else's plan. Harry turned back to his journal and added a 4th column. He labeled it, Allies. He wrote Hermione's name in it. The castle was, as all accounts had promised and none had adequately conveyed, tremendous. Harry stood in the fleet of boats crossing the Black Lake, Hermione beside him, and looked up at the lights of Hogwarts climbing the cliff face above the water, and let himself feel it, the weight of old magic, the hum he'd learned to recognize from the archive but which here was vastly louder, a chord rather than a note, centuries of casting and learning and living and dying layered into the stone until the stone was no longer just stone but something that had learned to vibrate with intention. The anchor was in there. He couldn't feel it precisely yet, couldn't pick it out from the general chorus of Hogwarts' magical field, but he would. He'd learned to navigate by feel, and given time and access and the company of someone who read school charters for fun, he'd find it. Hagrid was calling for the first years to stay in the boats, but Harry was already looking up, past the gates and the towers, toward the 3rd floor that the archive had referenced twice in the context of restricted magical infrastructure. 3rd floor. He'd checked the 3rd floor. The boats touched the bank and Harry stepped out and followed the crowd up toward the entrance, keeping Hermione beside him by the simple expedient of walking at her pace. She was looking at the castle too, but with a different kind of attention, cataloguing architecture, he suspected, noting exits or thinking about the library layout. He liked that about her. The way her mind worked in parallel to his but differently, not the same tool, but the same kind of tool, which was exactly what you needed when the work was complicated. Professor McGonagall was waiting at the entrance. She was the sharpest-looking person Harry had encountered outside of Ollivander, and when she addressed the first years with the particular authority of someone who means every word, Harry paid close attention. He also watched her eyes track over the group and pause, very briefly, on him. She knew who he was, of course. Everyone knew who he was. The question was what version of him she'd been expecting. The pause suggested the version she was looking at was producing a slight discrepancy from that expectation, which Harry found encouraging. Discrepancy was useful. Discrepancy meant the story they'd prepared about him had already encountered a reality that didn't quite fit. The Sorting Hat made a long speech about houses. Harry listened to it carefully, particularly the last line, for where you ought to be put. The Hat's opinion on where he ought to be put was, he supposed, its own business. But Harry had a preference, and when the Hat came down over his eyes and he felt the brush of something old and interested moving through his thoughts, "Ah," said the Hat's voice, dry and amused, "you know what you are," Harry thought very clearly, Gryffindor. Because the people I need to watch are there, and the people I need access to most are placed there, and because my father was Gryffindor and if there's a symbolic resonance to being sorted where he was sorted, I'm not above using it. Ruthless, the Hat said, sounding delighted. But honest about it. Gryffindor. And the table roared, and Harry walked to his seat and sat down, and across the hall, at the staff table, the headmaster who had sold his future smiled with his whole face and absolutely none of his eyes. Harry smiled back. The game had begun. Chapter 2, The boy who wasn't supposed to know the thing about Hogwarts was that it breathed. Harry noticed it on the first night, lying in the four-poster bed in the first-year boys' dormitory while Ron Weasley snored on his left and Neville Longbottom made small anxious sounds in his sleep on his right. The castle didn't just sit around being ancient and enormous. It moved, not the staircases, though those too, but beneath that, in the walls themselves, a slow rhythmic expansion and contraction, like the chest of something very large and very old that had learned to sleep lightly. The magic in the stones pulsed with it. Harry lay there listening to the pulse the way you listen to music you're trying to learn, picking out the structure underneath the sound. The archive hummed at a slightly different frequency than Hogwarts' general magic. He could feel the distinction now that he was inside the castle. The archive's note was higher, sharper, threaded through the broader chord like a single instrument in an orchestra that you only hear when you know to listen for it. It was coming from below. Below the castle's general depth, below whatever the foundations rested on, from somewhere that predated the school itself. Third floor, he'd thought on the lake. He revised that now, lying in the dark with his eyes open. Not third floor. Sub-basement. Or something that the architecture didn't officially recognize as a sub-basement, which was, in his experience, where the most important things tended to be kept. He filed the revision and closed his eyes. He did not sleep immediately. Through the dormitory's high windows, the Scottish sky was cloudless and dense with stars, and Harry spent the last half hour before sleep arranging his first month's objectives in priority order, which was something he'd learned to do young and which had gotten considerably more sophisticated since age 7. By the time he slept, he had a working agenda and the specific, settled feeling of someone who knows what tomorrow is for. Breakfast in the Great Hall was organized chaos made beautiful by proximity to very good food. Harry sat between Hermione and Neville, which was partly strategic and partly because Neville had accidentally sat in a spot that nobody else wanted due to the particular way the bench wobbled, and Harry had made a point of taking the seat beside him on the first morning simply because the expression on Neville's face when he'd braced for the social consequence of the wobbling bench and instead received a tablemate had been worth it. Neville had a roundness to him that wasn't quite clumsiness, more a kind of compressed uncertainty, as if he was permanently braced for something to go wrong and hadn't yet learned that his own anticipation was doing most of the damage. Harry liked him in the way he'd liked Hagrid, uncomplicated at the surface, but with something underneath that was worth more than the surface suggested. "The schedule looks manageable," Hermione said, studying the timetable she'd already organized into a color-coded chart on the back of her charms notes. "I've cross-referenced the core syllabus against the textbooks and I think if we read ahead in Transfiguration and Potions particularly, we'll have a significant advantage in." "Hermione," Harry said. "Yes. Have you slept?" She considered this. "I slept from 1 to 5:30, which is 6 hours more than I'd expected to manage given the excitement." "That's 4.5 hours. It was sufficient. I also located the library on a preliminary exploration of the 4th floor, which I know you'll want to know." "I do want to know that," Harry admitted. "It opens at 7 and closes at 11, with the restricted section accessible by teacher permission or by," she paused, consulting a small notation at the bottom of her color-coded chart, "by a prefect escort in cases of academic necessity. I think we can make a case for academic necessity by week 3 if our grades warrant special consideration." "By week 1, Harry said. She looked at him. "You think we can establish sufficient academic standing in the first week to warrant special consideration?" "I think you can establish it in the first 3 days, Harry said. "I'll keep pace." She looked at him with the particular expression she'd been deploying since the train, the one that said she was constantly recalibrating what to expect from him and finding the recalibration necessary more often than she'd anticipated. "You're very confident." "I have 4 years of research on what I need from this library," Harry said, reaching for the toast. "Confidence seems appropriate." Neville, who had been quietly working through a bowl of porridge and pretending not to listen, said, "Research on what?" "Magic," Harry said, which was true and complete and told Neville nothing. Neville nodded, satisfied with this, and returned to his porridge. Harry filed a note to have a more detailed conversation with Neville Longbottom at a time not yet determined but coming. The archive had a secondary contract record near his own, and Harry hadn't opened it on purpose, had been saving it, waiting until he was here, in the same space as the boy, before reading what it said. He wanted to see Neville clearly before the archive told him what to look for. What he saw so far, kind, self-doubting, fundamentally decent, in possession of a grandmother who had apparently impressed a very specific set of expectations onto him that didn't appear to match the actual shape of who he was. There was magic in him, clearly. Harry could feel the latent pressure of it, the way you feel a storm building before it breaks. It was just sitting there, waiting for the right conditions. Harry wondered if those conditions had been suppressed deliberately. He was beginning to wonder that about quite a few things. Professor McGonagall's Transfiguration class happened on a Wednesday morning in a bright high-ceilinged room that smelled of chalk and something faintly smoky, and it was the first class Harry attended where the professor in question was surprised by him. McGonagall opened with theory, the fundamental principle of transfiguration, the concentration required, the precise visualization, the wand work. She was a good teacher in the way of people who have high standards and extend them to their students without resentment. She demonstrated the matchstick-to-needle transformation with a wand movement and an expression so efficient it was almost aggressive, and then she set them to work. Most of the class produced matchsticks that were shinier than before. Ron Weasley's turned slightly silver at one end. Hermione produced a needle in 11 minutes, which caused McGonagall to look up from her desk with an expression of professional approval that she distributed to exactly one person per class per year. Harry's matchstick became a needle in 4 minutes. He was on his second by the time McGonagall came around to check progress. She stopped beside his desk and looked at the needle. Then at him. Then at a second needle, which he'd just produced from the third matchstick in his pile without particular ceremony. "Mr. Potter," she said. "Professor. Is this your first attempt at transfiguration?" "First formal attempt," Harry said. "I've read the theory fairly thoroughly. Reading the theory and executing the transformation are substantially different challenges." "Yes," Harry agreed. "But the theory's quite complete in Scamander's intermediate text, the one on the suggested reading list, not the first-year core text, and if you understand the visualization component clearly enough before you attempt it, the gap between theory and execution is smaller." He paused. "I hope I'm not getting ahead of the lesson." McGonagall looked at him for a moment with an expression he recognized from people encountering the distance between expectation and reality. "Continue," she said, which he did. After class, as the students filed out, she said his name once more. He stayed. She waited until the room was empty, which took longer than usual because Ron Weasley had dropped his matchstick behind a cabinet. When they were alone, she said, "Where did you study before Hogwarts?" "State school," Harry said. "And a great deal of independent reading. Your aunt and uncle did not arrange any magical tuition?" "My aunt and uncle," Harry said, pleasantly, "were not aware I was a wizard until Hagrid informed them, and they received that information poorly." McGonagall absorbed this in the way of someone who already knew it and was measuring whether he knew she knew it. "Professor Dumbledore has always maintained that your upbringing at Privet Drive was necessary." "Yes," Harry said. "He has." He said it with the flat courtesy of a comment that was also a period at the end of a sentence, closing the topic without hostility but without any openings either. Another pause. McGonagall was, he decided, genuinely sharp and genuinely complicated, the kind of person who had made accommodations with a system she partly believed in and partly doubted and had resolved the tension by simply being exceptionally good at her job and not looking too hard at the edges of the administrative decisions above her. She looked at him now with something that wasn't quite guilt and wasn't quite suspicion but lived in the neighborhood of both. "You remind me of your father," she said finally. "I've been told. He was also very talented. And very sure of himself." She paused. "It served him well, mostly." Harry smiled at that, the mostly doing a great deal of work in a small space. "I'll try to keep the mostly ratio favorable," he said, and went to his next class. Potions was Snape. Harry had prepared for Snape. The archive had a record on Severus Snape that Harry had read at age 10 and found considerably more interesting than most of the staff records, because it was the one staff record that contained its own annotation, not Dumbledore's cramped blue ink but a different hand, sharp and angular, in black, written directly over several of the fate threads in a way that obscured rather than clarified. Someone had been trying to revise the record. Not from outside, from within. Snape himself had accessed the archive at some point and attempted to edit his own fate threads. He hadn't succeeded. The archive's records were permanent, the original threads visible beneath the attempts, but the attempt itself was information. Snape knew about the archive. Snape had interacted with it. And whatever he'd tried to edit was something he didn't want visible in the official record. Harry walked into potions with this in mind. The dungeons were cold and greenlit and Snape moved through them with the authority of someone who considered the space a natural extension of himself. He swept in, took attendance with the energy of someone getting through a formality before reaching the part they actually cared about, and then stopped at Harry's name. "Ah yes," Snape said. "Harry Potter. Our new celebrity." The class watched with the specific attention of people who've been waiting to see which way a thing would go. "Hello, Professor," Harry said. "Tell me, Mr. Potter. What would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood?" "Draught of living death," Harry said. "One of the most powerful sleeping draughts known. Asphodel belongs to the lily family, which is interesting given," he paused, and watched Snape's face, given the associations. "Where would I find a bezoar?" "In the stomach of a goat." "What is the difference between monkshood and wolfsbane?" "Nothing, they're the same plant, also called aconite." The classroom was very quiet. Snape looked at him with eyes that were doing several things at once, assessing, recalculating, searching for the performance beneath the performance. Harry looked back with simple, open attention, the face of a boy answering questions correctly, nothing underneath it that he was allowing to show. "Eloquent," Snape said, in a tone that made the word do the opposite of compliment. "Fame apparently isn't everything." "I wasn't trying to be famous," Harry said. "I was trying to answer the question." He paused one beat, too. "Was that not what you wanted?" Another silence. Snape turned away with the clean precision of someone refusing to engage with something they don't yet understand, which told Harry everything, not hostility born of dislike, not the automatic antagonism the archive's record suggested he'd expected to find from Snape. Something more careful than that. Snape was taking measure. Good. That was the right response. A man who tried to edit his own fate threads and failed would be measuring very carefully. Harry opened his potions textbook and began to read the chapter they'd been assigned, and from across the aisle Hermione leaned fractionally toward him and said, barely audible, "You knew he was going to ask those questions." "No," Harry said, equally quiet. "I just know a lot about potions." "You knew," she said. Not accusing, filing. Adding to the growing document she was apparently maintaining of things Harry did that required later interrogation. He smiled at his textbook and said nothing. The week arranged itself around classes and meals and the particular social geography of being 11 and new somewhere, and Harry navigated it with the ease of someone who'd spent 4 years thinking about people and their motivations and had consequently developed a fairly functional model of how human beings organize themselves in groups. He was friendly without being eager. He was competent without making it a performance. He let the performance be in the work itself, in the answers and the wand work and the quiet consistency of being exactly what he was every day without variation, and let people draw their own conclusions. The conclusions people drew were fascinating. Ron Weasley decided Harry was excellent and said so loudly and often, which was generous and uncomplicated and Harry genuinely appreciated, even while noting that Ron's enthusiasm was the kind that would need a certain amount of managing in situations requiring subtlety. He liked Ron. Ron was honest in his bones, the way very few people were. What he felt was immediately visible on his face and he seemed to regard this not as a vulnerability but simply as a fact, which Harry found refreshing and occasionally alarming. Draco Malfoy, who had attempted on the first night to establish a social hierarchy with himself at the top and Harry on a lower rung adjacent to him, had by Wednesday abandoned this project after 2 failed attempts and was now regarding Harry from across the Great Hall with an expression that combined irritation and reluctant interest. Harry hadn't been openly hostile. He'd simply not cooperated, and done it with a pleasantness that denied Malfoy the satisfaction of a proper confrontation. From the archive he knew the Malfoy family name, knew Lucius Malfoy's record, which was adjacent to several of the darker Covenant records in the archive's outer stacks. He hadn't opened it yet. He intended to. By Thursday he'd identified which students were paying genuine attention and which were performing attention. By Friday he'd located the third-floor corridor, signposted by McGonagall as forbidden, and noted that the magical hum from the sub-basement beneath it was not, as he'd initially felt, the archive's anchor, but something else. Something recent. Something that had been placed there deliberately, within the last year, with a purpose the general magical field of Hogwarts hadn't fully absorbed yet. He filed that too. On Friday evening, while most of the Gryffindor first years were in the common room arguing about Quidditch or doing their first charms essay, Harry found a corner of the library and laid his notes out, and Hermione appeared beside him 7 minutes later with her own notes and an expression that indicated she'd also been thinking all week and was now prepared to talk. "All right," she said, sitting across from him. "Tell me what you've been noticing. In order of priority?" "In any order. I'll sort it." He liked this about her, the complete absence of the need to manage her ego. She knew she was capable and didn't require his acknowledgement of it to operate. It left a great deal of conversational space clear for actual content. He told her what he'd felt about the archive's location, not third floor, sub-basement, something old, something that predated the school. He told her about the third-floor corridor, which had a separate magical signature that didn't match the archive. He told her about Snape's attempted self-edit in the archive records. He told her about Dumbledore watching him at the sorting and every meal since with the specific quality of attention of someone waiting to see if a variable they don't control is going to behave as projected. Hermione organized this as he talked, her quill moving. "So the third floor is something different," she said. "Not the archive's anchor. Dumbledore put something there. Recently. Within the last year. And the anchor is deeper. Sub-basement level. Yes. But I can't access the sub-basement without knowing where the entrance is, and the castle's layout doesn't include an official sub-basement in anything I've read so far. The administrative edition of Hogwarts, A Magical History has a note in Appendix F, Hermione said, and produced the pamphlet from her bag. She'd apparently read it twice more since the train, if the number of bookmarks was any indication. It mentions that Hogwarts' original foundations include a chamber predating the school's construction, sealed by the 4 founders as a containment space for magical artifacts whose origin predated the Hogwarts Charter. It's not on any current school map because the founders sealed the access point. And you know where the access point is? I know where the access point was, which was the room directly beneath the Great Hall's eastern wall, according to a diagram in Appendix F that I cross-referenced with the architectural sketches in Hogwarts, an architectural history, which is in the reference section of the library. She showed him the cross-referenced diagram, sketched in her neat hand, the 2 sources layered into a single coherent picture. Harry looked at it. The access point was in a section of the eastern cloister that appeared, on the school's current maps, to be a disused storage room, which was exactly the kind of place the most important thing in the building would be kept. "Have you been to that cloister?" he asked. "Not yet. I thought we should go together." She paused. "Also, there's a gargoyle outside the storage room in question that I think is an active security measure rather than a decorative one. It looked at me when I went past Tuesday evening. Gargoyles don't look at you. This one did. Specifically, it tracked my movement for approximately 3 seconds and then faced forward again." She wrote something in the margin of the diagram. "I think we should consider a distraction." Harry thought about this. The archive had taught him a great deal about magical security. It was, itself, a form of magical security, and understanding how it worked had given him insight into how similar systems functioned. The gargoyle would be keyed to magical signatures, probably set to respond to intentional approach combined with a specific type of magical output. If you approached it thinking about something entirely different, doing something mundane, the trigger criteria might not be met. "I'll do it," he said. "You stay back and watch what it responds to. If it tracks me, we know what it keys on. If it doesn't, I'll examine the door." "That's a reasonable approach," Hermione said. "When?" "Sunday morning. Before breakfast. The castle's quietest then." She nodded and made a note. They worked for another hour on their charms essays, which both of them finished well within the length requirements, and then Harry went to bed. In the dormitory, he lay awake for 20 minutes thinking not about the sub-basement or the gargoyle or Snape's edited fate threads, but about Neville's sleeping shape across the room. The small anxious sounds had been quieter this week. The wobbling bench at meals hadn't happened again, partly because Harry had shown Neville how to brace the supporting leg with his foot without making it obvious. Small thing. Neville had looked at him with an expression of such disproportionate gratitude that it had made something uncomfortable move in Harry's chest, because gratitude that large for something that small came from a person who'd been given very little and had learned to be overwhelmed by ordinary kindness. He decided to open Neville's record in the archive soon. Before he needed the information, not after, so that whatever he found there he could process without urgency. He slept. Sunday morning was grey and damp, the castle emerging from October mist like a thought that hadn't quite finished forming. Harry went down to the eastern cloister at 6:10, alone, carrying his charms textbook open at a chapter he'd already read, walking with the purposeful, slightly distracted energy of someone on their way to breakfast who'd meant to leave the book upstairs and had just noticed. The gargoyle was at the end of the cloister, flanking a door of dark wood that looked so uninteresting it was almost aggressive about it. Harry approached at a conversational pace, eyes on the textbook, mind carefully occupied with a charms problem that was sufficiently engaging to produce genuine cognitive noise. He'd learned in the archive that you couldn't fake mental distraction, you had to actually be thinking about something. And he'd become skilled at genuine multitasking precisely because it was the only reliable way to make his approach to the archive feel incidental rather than intentional. He was 3 feet from the gargoyle when he glanced up as if surprised by the architecture, let his eyes pass over the gargoyle and the door and the wall behind it, and continued past without stopping. The gargoyle did not move. He turned the cloister corner and found Hermione 20 feet away, pressed against the wall, watching. "Nothing," she said quietly. "It didn't react at all." "It's keyed to intentional approach," Harry said. "Specifically looking. If you approach with your full attention on the door or the gargoyle, it triggers. If your attention is elsewhere, you pass. That's a fairly sophisticated security system for an officially abandoned storage room. Which tells us the storage room isn't as abandoned as it's meant to appear." He looked back down the cloister. "I'll need to actually examine the door without looking like I'm examining the door, which requires getting past the gargoyle and being right in front of the door without the gargoyle registering intentional approach." "Peripheral attention," Hermione said immediately. "Like how you read the archive, tilting your head slightly so the thing you're looking at isn't in your direct line of sight. If the gargoyle's trigger is direct gaze attention combined with intentional approach, you might be able to examine the door with peripheral vision if your stated approach is something on the adjacent wall." "There's a very old mural on the adjacent wall," Harry said. He'd noticed it in his pass, faded but detailed, magical figures moving sluggishly in the paint. "If I stop to look at the mural, I could use the peripheral angle to observe the door without direct engagement." "Try it." He went back. Approached the cloister again with the textbook tucked under his arm now, looking straight at the mural from 30 feet out, walking slowly, the manner of someone interested in old art on a quiet Sunday morning. The gargoyle didn't stir. He stopped in front of the mural, tilted his weight back on his heels, tilted his head slightly to the left. In his peripheral vision, the door at the end of the cloister revealed itself more clearly. He could see the grain of the wood, which was strange, much stranger than ordinary old wood, almost metallic in its density, and at the base of the door, barely visible if you were looking for it directly but obvious in peripheral view, a thin line of light. Not lamplight or daylight from within. The particular sourceless light of the archive. Confirmation. The anchor was through that door, down below. He turned casually away from the mural and walked back to Hermione with his hands in his pockets. "It's there," he said. She let out a slow breath. "So we need to get through the door." "Not yet. We need to know more about what we'll find inside before we open it." He looked at her steadily. "This is the part where we need the restricted section. The Covenant Law subsection specifically." She straightened up, and the expression on her face was the one he'd come to recognize as finally, a problem with a specific solvable shape. "Professor Flitwick," she said. "He responds well to genuine academic enthusiasm, and he had that edition of Charms and Contracts on his desk on Thursday, the Bellerophon edition, which includes the pre-1800 Covenant Law Appendix. If I asked him a question about contract magic that required access to the restricted section's Covenant subsection, I think he'd write the note." "Monday," Harry said. "Ask him Monday. I'll have a list of the specific texts we need by then." "I already have a list," she said, and produced it from the pocket of her robes. He looked at it. It was thorough and accurate and included 2 texts he'd thought of and one he hadn't, which was a text on architectural magic and concealed containment, which wasn't strictly Covenant law but was exactly what they'd need for understanding the sub-basement. "This is excellent," he said. "I know," she said. "Shall we get breakfast?" Flitwick wrote the note on Monday afternoon, with a warmth that suggested the question Hermione had asked, about the magical enforceability of pre-birth contracts under ancient Covenant law, had delighted him in the way of questions that arrived from unexpected quarters. He'd looked at Harry across his desk when Hermione asked and said, "Is this a theoretical interest or a practical one?" with the tone of a man who knew it was practical. "Theoretical," Harry said pleasantly. Said Flitwick, and wrote the note. The restricted section's Covenant law subsection was at the back of the library's restricted area, accessible through a half-height door that required the note and, beyond the note, a basic unlocking charm performed correctly. Hermione did the charm on the first attempt with characteristic precision, and they went in. The room was small and cold, and the books on the shelves had the quality of the archive's outer section, a weight to them, a sense of accumulated significance, that made the air around them slightly denser. Harry went directly to the shelves, reading spines, pulling 3 texts in under 2 minutes. "You know exactly what you're looking for," Hermione observed. "I've had 4 years to compile the bibliography." "That's, actually, yes. Of course you have." She was already examining another shelf, pulling a text on architectural containment and opening it at the index. "Here. Founder-era sub-basements. There are 4 documented cases of Founder-era containment chambers in British magical architecture, with Hogwarts listed as primary example." She read for a moment. "The access mechanism described here isn't mechanical, it's intention-based. The door responds to the individual whose magical signature is most deeply associated with the contained object." Harry went very still. "Whose signature is most deeply associated with the contract?" She looked at him. He looked at her. "Yours," she said. "The contract is on you. Your soul thread runs through it. The anchor would recognize you above anyone. Then I should be able to open the door. It seems so." She frowned at the text. "But there may be a secondary keying. If Dumbledore has been maintaining the contract, visiting the archive, managing the annotations, his signature might have been layered over yours in the access mechanism. Then we need to establish which signature the door prioritizes. Mine, because I'm the contracted party, or his, because he's the current maintainer. The text suggests primary party recognition supersedes maintenance signatures," Hermione said, reading carefully. "But it's written for cases where the primary party has full knowledge of the contract, which," she stopped. "Which I do," Harry said. She looked at him with an expression that was, he thought, something close to the first moment of awe he'd seen from her. Not awe at power exactly, but awe at the specific shape of his situation, the elegance of it, the way 4 years of quiet preparation had converged into a single point of leverage. "You read your own contract at age 7, she said. "In the archive." Which means you've had full knowledge of the contract since before I could legally be a party to it, Harry said. Which is itself an interesting complication that I've been sitting with for 4 years. Hermione sat down on the nearest chair and put the book on her knees and was silent for a moment in the way she was silent when she was actually moved rather than just thinking. Harry, she said. If the door recognizes you, if you can open it, what are you going to do? Read the anchor document, Harry said. Understand its exact terms. Find every technical vulnerability and every valid challenge point. He pulled the last of his 3 texts from the shelf, the heaviest one, a massive volume on covenant enforcement and dissolution procedures, and opened it to a chapter he'd been waiting 4 years to read in full. And then start building the argument that voids it. Before the architects. Before the architects, he confirmed. She was quiet again. Then, you're going to need to argue your own case in front of beings that have been in the business of binding people's fates for centuries. Yes. At age 11. Preferably not. I'm hoping to delay the actual argument until I'm in a stronger position. But I need to understand the battlefield before I can plan the fight. She looked at him. He looked at her. She opened the architectural containment text back to the relevant chapter and began taking notes with the focused efficiency of someone who had signed on to something and was fully committed to it. All right, she said. Let's understand the battlefield. They left the restricted section an hour before dinner with 4 pages of Hermione's notes, 3 of Harry's, and a significantly clearer picture of what they were dealing with. In the corridor outside the library, Harry stopped walking. Hermione, 3 steps ahead, turned. What is it? He was looking at the far end of the corridor, where a figure in dark robes was standing with the specific stillness of someone who had been standing there for a while and had made no effort to conceal it. Snape. Not moving. Not walking. Just standing, looking at them, and there was nothing in his expression that was readable except that it was not the expression of a professor doing a corridor patrol. It was the expression of a man who had been looking for something and had just found it in a more complete form than expected. Harry met his gaze across the length of the corridor. Snape moved first, turned and walked away, robes sweeping, without a word. He was watching us come out of the restricted section, Hermione said quietly. He was watching us, Harry said. Not the section specifically. He was watching for us. Because of potions? Maybe. Or because, Harry thought about the edited fate threads, the black angular hand layered over the original archive record, the access that implied. Or because he knows what we're looking for and he's been wondering when we'd start. Should we be worried about him? Harry considered this carefully. Snape was a man with his own relationship to the archive, his own history with it, his own attempt to control the record. He wasn't Dumbledore's instrument. The archive's records were clear that Snape's loyalties were complicated enough to resist simple description. He was capable of genuine malice and apparently also capable of things that required a more nuanced accounting. Not yet, Harry said. But I want to talk to him. Hermione stared. You want to, voluntarily talk to Snape? He knows about the archive, Harry said. And he tried to edit his own record, which means he had access to it at some point, which means he knows how it works. He might know things about the Anchor's access mechanism that the books don't. Or he might report us to Dumbledore. He won't, Harry said. Something in the encounter, the specifics of where Snape had stood and how he'd stood there and the very deliberate way he'd walked away rather than toward them, said not. He's not going to Dumbledore with this. If he were going to Dumbledore he'd have done it already and he'd have walked toward us, not away. Hermione chewed on this. You read a lot into walking away. He could have ignored us entirely. He chose not to ignore us and then chose not to approach. That's a very specific middle position. Harry started walking. It means he's deciding. And I'd rather talk to him while he's still deciding than wait for him to finish. When? Soon. Before Halloween. They walked to dinner in the gathering dark of early October, and in the great hall the candles were lit and floating and the smell of food was warm and simple, and at the staff table Dumbledore caught Harry's eye with a benevolent, twinkling look that was doing considerable work to cover something less comfortable underneath it, and Harry gave him a polite, neutral smile that revealed nothing and contained everything, and reached for the potatoes. Across the table, Neville accidentally knocked his pumpkin juice into his lap, and the face he made was so perfectly resigned to the inevitability of this exact disaster that Harry laughed, genuinely, without planning it, the laugh of someone caught off guard by something real in the middle of a great deal that was calculated, and the sound of it surprised him, how easily it came, how little it had to do with 7-year-olds in cupboards and contracts and 4-year plans. He helped Neville mop up the juice with a handful of napkins and told him about the time Dudley had poured an entire jug of orange squash over his own head trying to drink it lying down, which was the kind of story that required being told for its own sake, and Neville laughed and the laugh loosened something in the rounded, compressed uncertainty of him, and for a moment in the warm candlelit hall surrounded by the particular chaos of a few hundred children eating dinner, Harry was just 11 years old, which he didn't get to be often, and it wasn't bad. It wasn't bad at all. He found Snape on a Thursday evening. Not by accident. He'd mapped Snape's Thursday evening routine in the first 2 weeks. The man walked the dungeons at 7, the ground floor at 7:30, and then, this was the part most students didn't know, went to a particular alcove on the second floor that contained a window facing north and a stone bench that looked like decorative architecture and sat there for 20 minutes with no particular purpose visible from outside. Harry had observed it twice from a careful distance, obscured by a corner, and decided the alcove was where Snape went when he needed to think without being interrupted. He sat down on the stone bench at 7:05. He was reading the Covenant dissolution text, the long chapter on challenge procedures, when Snape appeared in the alcove entrance at 7:23 and stopped. The silence had a very specific quality. "How long have you known about this alcove?" Snape said, finally. "About 10 days, Harry said, turning a page. "And you chose to be here this particular evening because I want to talk to you," Harry said, "and I thought meeting on ground you chose was more productive than ambushing you somewhere else. This is where you come to think, so you'll be in a thinking frame of mind." He looked up. "Please sit down, Professor. I'll be quick." Snape looked at him for a very long moment with eyes that were doing many things simultaneously and concealing most of them. He sat down on the bench, at the far end, with a good 3 feet of stone between them, which Harry noted and didn't comment on. "You know about the archive," Harry said. Snape said nothing. "You accessed it at some point in the last decade and tried to edit your own fate threads. You didn't succeed, the original entries are visible beneath the attempt." Harry kept his voice flat and factual, nothing in it designed to wound. "I'm not interested in what you were editing or why. I'm telling you because you need to understand that I know, so we can talk plainly." Snape's face was doing something extraordinary in its control, like a face determined to give nothing away by refusing to move at all. "You have been in the archive," he said. It wasn't a question. "Since I was 7. The control flickered. "Just once, just briefly." 7, he repeated, and it came out with a different quality than everything else he'd said, flatter, harder, with the sound of someone redoing a calculation they were certain was right and finding a different answer. "I found my own ledger. I read the contract. I've been researching dissolution procedures since." Harry closed the book in his lap. "Professor Snape. I need to know about the anchor in the sub-basement beneath the eastern cloister. Specifically, the access mechanism. Whether the primary party's recognition supersedes a maintenance signature." Snape stared at him. The stare had layers, calculation, surprise, something that might have been alarm and was carefully managed, and then it settled into something harder and more considering. "You intend to go in," Snape said. "I intend to read the anchor document in situ and identify every valid challenge point. Then, eventually, argue the dissolution before the full covenant." A pause. Long, dense, the quality of a person running through consequences. "You understand that if you open that chamber, the architects will know." It will appear in the Covenant records as a primary party access event. I know, Harry said. That's fine. Snape stared at him. You want them to know. I want the process to begin properly, Harry said. Primary party access is, according to the dissolution precedents, the first formal step in initiating a challenge. If I open the chamber and the record registers my access, the architects are formally notified that the primary party has become aware. At that point, the clock starts on their obligation to provide me with a full accounting of the contract's terms. He held up the Covenant dissolution text. Chapter 14. The Notification Principle. Once awareness is formally registered, all parties have 6 months to prepare their positions before a hearing can be called. Snape looked at the book in Harry's hand. You've read Chapter 14, he said. I've read all 36 chapters, Harry said. Chapter 14 3 times. Another silence. Snape stood up from the bench, moved to the alcove's entrance, and stood there with his back half-turned, looking out into the corridor, the posture of a man who was thinking something he didn't want visible on his face. The primary party recognition supersedes the maintenance signature, Snape said, finally, without turning around. But only if the primary party approaches with complete, deliberate knowledge of the contract's full terms. Not partial knowledge. Not theoretical knowledge. He stopped. Complete. I've read it all, Harry said. Twice. I'll read it once more before I open the door. Snape turned then, enough to look at him from the edge of his periphery. Dumbledore will know the moment the architects are notified. Yes, Harry said. He will not, Snape stopped. Reconsidered whatever word he'd been going to use. He will act. He'll try, Harry said. And I look forward to seeing which actions he chooses, because they'll tell me how worried he is, and how worried he is will tell me exactly how solid his position actually is. Snape turned fully and looked at him across the alcove, and Harry looked back with the calm, open, clear-eyed patience of a boy who had been living in the solution to this problem since he was 7 years old and had simply been waiting for the world to provide the tools. Snape said something then that Harry didn't expect. Your mother would have been, he started, and stopped. Tried again. Stopped again. Would have been what? Harry asked, gently. A pause. When Snape spoke, his voice was the most human it had been in the entire conversation. Interested, he said. In all of this. She was always interested in the things that weren't supposed to be possible. Harry thought about Lily's handwriting in the archive, different from Dumbledore's, different from James's, precise and careful, and in the places where the contract had been negotiated, urgent. I know, he said. She was the one who insisted on the release clause. Snape looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned and walked out of the alcove, and his footsteps went down the corridor and faded, and Harry sat alone with the dissolution text in his lap and the archive humming distantly in the back of his awareness, and the specific quality of silence left by a conversation that had changed something in both participants. He looked down at the book. Chapter 14. The Notification Principle. He thought, 6 months. 6 months from the moment he opened the door, the clock would run, and the architects would have to prepare their accounting, and Dumbledore would have to make choices, and Harry would watch those choices and learn from each one what the man was genuinely afraid of. He put the book under his arm and walked back to the Gryffindor common room, where Ron was losing at chess to Hermione, who had worked out the game in 2 weeks and was now managing the pieces with the systematic efficiency she brought to everything, and Neville was sitting near the fire with a book on herbology held upside down, which he hadn't noticed, and the fire was warm and the evening was young enough to hold possibility. Harry sat down. He noted that Hermione won the chess game in 4 more moves. He noted that Neville's book was upside down and said nothing, and a few minutes later Neville noticed himself and went red and laughed, and Harry laughed too, and the evening was simple and good, and underneath it, deeper and quieter and more certain than anything he could name, the clock was already ticking. Chapter 3, Contracts and Consequences. The door opened like it recognized him. No dramatic creak. No resistance. Harry placed his palm flat against the dark wood, the same gesture he'd used against the cupboard wall at age 7, unhurried, deliberate, and the door simply swung inward on silent hinges, as if it had been waiting with the patience of something that understood waiting better than anything else. The gargoyle didn't move. Harry had approached from the mural end of the cloister at 10 past midnight, his attention genuinely occupied with the full text of the contract he'd been reviewing in his memory for the past hour, every clause, every term, every marginal notation, the complete knowledge that Snape had told him was required. The gargoyle hadn't twitched. Hadn't breathed. Had been, as far as Harry could determine, entirely fooled by the specifics of how he was thinking. He stepped through the door. Hermione was 2 steps behind him. He hadn't told her not to come. He hadn't told her to come either. He'd told her when and where, and she'd appeared at 10 to midnight in the common room with her notes and her wand and an expression that said she'd spent the evening preparing for this and didn't require further instruction on her role. He'd been grateful for that. He wasn't always good at asking for company, for years of solitary planning had made him more self-sufficient than was probably healthy, and he recognized that Hermione's particular version of presence, which involved being extraordinarily useful and not requiring constant emotional management, was exactly the kind of company he could accept without it feeling like a concession. The room beyond the door was small and plain and held nothing except a staircase leading down. Old stone stairs, spiral, lit by the same sourceless light that lived in the archive, not the archive itself, but the same family of light, older than lanterns, the kind of illumination that existed because magic had decided this space should be visible and hadn't bothered with a mechanism. The stairs went down further than the castle's visible architecture should have allowed. Harry counted 37 steps and emerged into a chamber. Hermione came down behind him and stopped 2 steps from the bottom and looked at what was in the chamber and said nothing for a moment. The anchor was a table. Or rather, the anchor was on a table, a plain stone table, waist-high, in the center of a chamber that was roughly circular and whose walls were covered in the same shifting script as the Covenant records in the archive. On the table sat a document, single page, in the silver-edged material he'd seen in his own ledger upstairs. Around it, connected by threads so fine they were nearly invisible except in the sourceless light, where they glowed faint silver, like spider silk catching dew, were 3 smaller documents arranged at equal distances. 3 subsidiary contracts, Hermione said quietly. The main document and 3, she crossed to one of the smaller documents, moving slowly, hands clasped behind her back so she didn't accidentally touch anything. She read in silence for a moment. This one is the brokerage record. This is, she moved to the second, this is a performance bond. And this one, she moved to the third, then stopped. Harry came around the table to look at it. The third document was in a different hand from the others. Smaller, less formal, written with the urgency of someone who knew they were writing against time. He recognized the script immediately, he'd found it in the archive, in the margins of the oldest pages, in the places where the contract had been contested before being signed. His mother's handwriting. He picked it up. The silver-edged material was cool and slightly resistant in his hands, like paper that was also something else, and as he held it the threads connecting it to the main contract thrummed very gently, a single note in the archives chord. He read it. It was longer than he'd expected. The release clause was there, the one he'd found in the archive at age 7, but it was accompanied by 10 additional clauses he hadn't seen in the archive's copy, which had only shown him the summary. His mother had written the full version here. Every conditional. Every contingency. Every specification for what free would mean, defined with the precision of someone who had understood exactly how language could be used to narrow a promise into meaninglessness and had refused to let that happen. She'd been extraordinary. He let himself feel that for exactly one moment, the shape of a person he'd never met, visible in the architecture of her argument, in the way she'd anticipated every countermove and closed every door before it could be opened. She'd been extraordinary and she'd been 21 years old when she wrote this and she'd known she was writing it for a son who hadn't been born yet and might never read it. He'd read it. He was reading it now. He thought, she knew I'd find it. Not hoped. Knew. He carefully returned the document to its position on the table. The release clause has 10 subclauses, he said. Dumbledore's annotations in the archive only reference the primary clause. The subclauses include a provision that the secondary party, me, must be allowed complete information access at any point from age 7 onward if requested or discovered. Dumbledore has been in violation of that provision for 4 years. Hermione looked up from the brokerage record she'd been reading. Her expression was the one she wore when a calculation produced a number larger than expected. That's a material breach, she said. Of a contract he was a party to. A material breach, Harry agreed. Which, under Chapter 22 of the dissolution text, constitutes grounds for the injured party to request immediate covenant review regardless of the 6-month notification period. She stared at him. You don't have to wait 6 months. No. He looked at the main contract. I can request the hearing as soon as the architects acknowledge primary party access, which they'll do as soon as we leave this room and the access event is registered. And when I request the hearing, I'm requesting it on the grounds of material breach, which puts Dumbledore in the position of defending his management of the contract in front of the architects rather than me in the position of challenging it. Hermione was quiet for 5 full seconds. You just flipped the burden of proof. My mother wrote the subclauses, Harry said. I think that was what she intended. He looked around the chamber, at the walls covered in shifting script. The script was denser here than in the archive upstairs, the architect's language, the foundational legal framework, centuries of covenant law layered into stone like rings in a tree. Read the main contract, he said. I need your read on the performance bond. She moved to the main contract without touching it, reading in situ, and Harry moved to the performance bond and read it carefully. It was the part of the transaction that defined what Dumbledore was owed, what the architects had promised him in exchange for Harry's fate. It was not, as Harry had expected from the archive summary, simply Voldemort's defeat. It was more specific. More structural. It was a guarantee of Dumbledore's position. Of his authority. Of the continuation of the magical world's administrative structure in a specific form, one that kept Dumbledore at or near its center. The architects hadn't just promised him a solution to Voldemort. They'd promised him the world after Voldemort, arranged to his satisfaction. Harry read that twice. Then he read it once more. The performance bond, he said. It's not about Voldemort specifically. Hermione looked up from the main contract. What do you mean? Voldemort is the instrument, not the purpose. The purpose, what Dumbledore was actually purchasing, was permanent institutional authority. A guaranteed post-war structure that would cement his role as the definitive magical authority in Britain. Harry set the document down. He wasn't just trying to defeat Voldemort. He was trying to win the world after Voldemort using my fate as the down payment. The chamber was very quiet. That's, Hermione started, and stopped, and tried again. That changes his motivation significantly. Yes. It means the good intentions are more complicated than they looked. They were always more complicated than they looked, Harry said. The archive's been showing me complicated for 4 years. But this is the part that matters for the hearing. Because the architects promised him institutional authority. And if I void the contract, that promise collapses with it. He doesn't just lose his management of my fate threads. He loses the guarantee. He loses everything he traded for. And that, Harry said, is why he's been managing the annotations. Not to protect me. Not even to manage the Voldemort situation. He's been managing the narrative of the contract to protect the guarantee. He looked at the silver threads connecting the 4 documents. The question is whether the architect's obligation to him survives a finding of material breach. Chapter 22, Hermione said immediately, because she had apparently read that chapter too. A finding of material breach by any party to the covenant renders all dependent promises voidable at the court's discretion. Voidable, Harry said. Not automatically void. Discretion of the architects. She paused. Which is, that's the part we can't predict. No. But we can argue for it. He looked at her. Are you comfortable with everything you've read in here? Do you need more time? She shook her head. I have what I need. A pause. Harry. Yes. Your mother's subclauses. The information access provision from age 7. She looked at him carefully. You said you've been in violation, that Dumbledore has been in violation, for 4 years. But you did access the information. You found the archive, you read the contract, you've been researching for 4 years. The violation occurred, but you weren't actually denied the access. Harry looked at her. What's your point? My point is that the strongest version of the breach argument isn't that you were denied information. It's that you were denied the support that should have accompanied the information. The subclause says, complete information access, but it also says, with appropriate accompaniment by an informed guardian. She produced her notes from a pocket, she'd brought notes, of course she'd brought notes, and found the relevant line. There's a phrase in subclause 4, the secondary party shall not navigate the contract's terms without appropriate guidance. You navigated the entire thing alone, at age 7, in a cupboard, during a punishment. The chamber was very quiet again. Yes, Harry said, after a moment. That's not a technicality, Hermione said, and her voice was different now, carefully controlled in the way of someone making sure they were saying what they meant to say. That's a child being left alone with information that required adult support. I know what it is, Harry said, gently. I just want to make sure we include it, she said. In the argument. Not for sympathy. Because it's the clearest possible demonstration of material breach. The subclause is explicit. We'll include it, Harry said. You're right to flag it. It's exactly the kind of specific, documented instance that makes an abstract argument concrete in front of a court. He paused. Thank you. She nodded and put her notes away and was professional about it, and Harry appreciated the professionalism for exactly what it was, her way of caring about something without letting the caring get in the way of the work. They went back up the stairs, through the door, down the cloister. Behind them the door swung closed. Above them, somewhere in the invisible structure of Covenant law, the access event registered, a primary party interaction with the anchor documents, complete and deliberate and witnessed, logged in the architect's records with the mechanical impartiality of a system that had been running for centuries and knew exactly what this meant. The clock started. Harry felt it. Not physically, not in the way you feel a bell or a timer. In the way you feel a game begin, the specific change in the air when the pieces are on the board and all parties are committed. Good. Dumbledore knew by morning. Harry could tell because at breakfast the headmaster's attention had changed quality. Before, it had been the attention of a man monitoring a variable he expected to control. Now it was the attention of a man who had received information that required recalibration, and was performing normality very slightly too carefully. The toast was very good. Harry ate his breakfast with complete equanimity and did not look at the staff table more than once. Hermione, beside him, was eating with the focused efficiency of someone storing energy for a demanding day, and occasionally making small notes in the margin of her charms textbook, which were not about charms. Harry had seen 2 of the margin notes clearly enough to read them, subclause 4, documented instances and performance bond language, permanent institutional, check architect's precedents for similar guarantees. He didn't tell her to stop making notes in the charms textbook. The notes were good. Neville appeared on Harry's other side with a plate loaded with scrambled eggs and the particular morning energy of someone who'd slept well for once, less compressed, more present, the uncertainty not gone but temporarily not in charge. Did you finish the herbology essay? He asked Harry. Last night, Harry said. I wrote 3 feet and then realized I'd misread the question and it wanted 2 feet maximum. Neville's expression was perfectly philosophical about this. I had to cut out the entire section about Devil's Snare, which was the best part. Devil's Snare relaxes when you stop fighting it, Harry said. Interesting plant. Neville brightened with the specific illumination of someone whose natural passion has been accidentally addressed. Did you know it can be trained? There's a method in the second-year text. If you introduce it to controlled light stimuli repeatedly, it develops a response pattern that you can actually. He stopped. Sorry. Hermione says I go on about plants. Hermione goes on about contract law, Harry said. I go on about archive theory. We're all insufferable about something, Neville. Tell me about the training method. Neville told him about the training method for the rest of breakfast, and his hands moved as he talked, and the compressed uncertainty loosened fractionally more, and Harry listened and asked 2 questions and Neville answered both with genuine authority and seemed surprised afterward that he'd answered with genuine authority, as if he kept forgetting he was allowed to know things. It was the most significant herbology education Harry had received, and also, he thought, watching Neville's face, a small important practice run at the version of himself Neville might eventually grow into if enough things loosened. The first sign that Dumbledore was going to move quickly came on Wednesday. Harry was walking from Transfiguration when Professor Quirrell, who taught defense against the dark arts in a performance of nervous stammer that Harry had found suspicious since the first lesson, because the stammer wasn't consistent, it intensified in public and disappeared in one-on-one situations, which wasn't how stammers worked, approached him in the corridor with an expression of thin, effortful concern. Ah, P. Potter, Quirrell said. The headmaster would like a word. His office. After dinner. Of course, Harry said. Thank you, Professor. Quirrell nodded, twitched, and walked away. Harry continued to Transfiguration and spent the lesson turning a teapot into a tortoise. He managed it in 6 minutes, gave it another 4 to perfect the tale, and spent the remaining time thinking about what Dumbledore would want to discuss, how he would frame it, and what Harry's optimal response to each possible framing would be. He told Hermione at lunch. He's moving to contain the situation, she said immediately. He'll try to assess how much you know and make you feel that whatever you know is incomplete. That's my read too. He won't mention the contract directly, he'll approach obliquely. He might offer something, Hermione said. Something that positions him as the provider of information, to make it seem like you're dependent on his goodwill for your understanding. Which would be effective if I didn't already have the full text of the contract and documented grounds for material breach, Harry said. Yes. So the question is how much you let him see. She looked at him. What do you want him to know? Harry thought about this with genuine consideration. It was a good question, the kind that required balancing multiple objectives. He wanted Dumbledore unsettled. He wanted him making choices under uncertainty, because a man making choices under uncertainty made informative choices. But he didn't want him panicked. Panic in a person with Dumbledore's resources and experience and genuine intelligence was actually dangerous, because it could produce decisive action rather than the more useful measured action. I want him to know that I know about the contract, Harry said. Enough to confirm that the access event was deliberate, not accidental. I don't want him to know yet what specific arguments I'm building. And I don't want him to know about the subclauses. If he thinks you only know the primary clause, he'll assume the material breach grounds are weaker than they are. Exactly. Hermione nodded and added something to the margin of her defense against the dark arts notes, which were also not about defense against the dark arts. Dumbledore's office was everything the archive had described and more, the circular room, the moving portraits, the various instruments that measured things Harry couldn't immediately identify, the quality of accumulated authority that was indistinguishable, in this space, from accumulated wisdom. Harry sat across from the large desk and accepted the offered lemon drop with a polite thank you and put it in his pocket without eating it, which was a small choice that he saw register in Dumbledore's eyes. Harry, the headmaster said, and his voice was warm with the complete, genuine warmth of a man who had decades of practice at warmth and whose warmth was not, Harry was entirely certain, entirely performed. He did love Harry, in whatever complicated way was available to someone who had made the calculation he'd made. That was the part that was true and also not enough. I imagine your first weeks at Hogwarts have been remarkable. Very, Harry said. You've settled in well. Minerva speaks highly of you. Professor Flitwick as well. A pause. I understand you've been spending time in the library. Enjoying your studies? Enormously. The warmth in Dumbledore's eyes adjusted by a small, precise degree, still warm, but now doing more work. I also understand that you and Miss Granger have been exploring the more historical sections of the library. Contract theory, architectural history. He smiled. Broad interests for first years. We're curious people, Harry said. Curiosity is one of magic's finest qualities, Dumbledore said. It is also, occasionally, a quality that can lead us toward things we are not yet equipped to understand fully. He looked at Harry with the specific patience of someone making space for a response. Harry gave him a response, a pleasant, open look that confirmed nothing and denied nothing. Dumbledore continued. Harry, there are aspects of your history, of the magical world's recent history, that are complex and that I have always intended to share with you at an appropriate time. When you were better able to understand them? Harry said. Or to accept them? A pause. Just a small one. Just the length of a man noting that the expected response pattern had not occurred. Both, perhaps, Dumbledore said, with a gentleness that was genuine. The world made certain decisions in the years before your birth that affected you in ways that were not your choice. I have always borne the weight of that. Good, Harry said. The pause this time was longer. Dumbledore looked at him across the desk and Harry looked back and something moved through the old man's face that was, underneath all the warmth and wisdom and deliberate performance, the expression of a person encountering a situation that is not going the way any of the planning accounted for. You've seen the archive, Dumbledore said. Not a question. Yes, Harry said. For how long? Quite a while. And you understand, Harry, the decisions made in those records were made under extraordinary pressure, with the weight of many lives, many futures, dependent on. I'm not asking for an explanation tonight, Harry said. His voice was perfectly level, perfectly friendly. I'm not here to have that conversation yet. I just wanted to come when you invited me, because it seemed polite. Another long pause. Dumbledore looked at him, this time without the warmth in the foreground, just the look itself, and it was sharp and deep and genuinely assessing, the look of a man who was very old and very intelligent and was updating his model of something substantially. You're waiting, Dumbledore said. I'm preparing, Harry said. The silence that followed was the most honest thing that had happened in the office. Dumbledore sat with it for a moment, and Harry watched the old man decide something, not capitulation, nothing so simple, but a recalibration of approach, a decision to wait and observe further rather than act on incomplete information about what exactly Harry knew and intended. Good. That was the best outcome from this conversation, Dumbledore choosing the measured path. Is there anything you'd like to ask me? Dumbledore said, finally. Anything I can tell you, now, that might, there is one thing, Harry said. Yes. Neville Longbottom. He watched Dumbledore's face. The reaction was small but completely legible, a fractional tightening around the eyes, a control mechanism engaging. I'd like to know about Neville Longbottom's history. His family situation. Whether there's anything in his background I should be aware of. He kept his tone light, curious, the tone of a boy making small talk about a dormitory friend. He seems like he's been carrying something heavy for a while. Neville is, Dumbledore said, choosing his words carefully, a young man with a great deal of potential and a family history that has been difficult. His parents, Harry said. Are they well? They are, Dumbledore said, and the slight emphasis on "are" did exactly the work Harry needed it to, receiving care at St. Mungo's Hospital. Both of them, Harry said. How long? Since Neville was very young. Since he was about a year old, Harry said. Not a question. He'd read the archive's secondary record dates and knew the timing. That's a long time for a child to grow up without parents. It is, Dumbledore said, and the warmth was doing considerable heavy lifting again. It is something I think about. I'm sure you do, Harry said, pleasantly, and stood up. "Thank you for the invitation, Professor. Good night." He walked out of the office and down the moving staircase and through the dark corridors toward the Gryffindor common room, and the feeling that moved through him as he walked was not triumph. He'd been careful to avoid triumph, which was the emotion most likely to make you careless, but something steadier and more useful. He was beginning to see the shape of all of it. Not just his own contract. The whole architecture. He opened Neville's record on a Saturday. Not in the archive's usual way. He didn't go in at night through the wall space behind the cupboard, which was in Surrey and not here. At Hogwarts, the archive's entrance was different. He'd found it in the first week, in the small alcove off the Gryffindor common room that most students used as a space for private conversation and that had, in its back wall, the same depth behind solid feeling he'd learned to recognize at age 7. He'd confirmed it on the second Thursday by pressing his palm to the back wall with his mind occupied with the complete contract, and the wall had received the lien. He went in on Saturday afternoon when the common room was half empty and nobody was watching the alcove particularly. He walked his familiar route through the archive's geography, his own ledger glowing at its chest-height shelf, the Covenant records 2 rows over, the historical stack stretching in every direction, and found the secondary shelf where he'd noted Neville's record 4 years ago. He picked it up. Neville Francis Longbottom. The binding was brown, unremarkable, medium thickness. He opened it. Neville's history was largely what he'd expected, a family with significant magical heritage, parents who had been Aurors, a childhood spent with a formidable grandmother who had decided that Neville would fulfill the potential his parents could no longer model for him and had imposed this decision with the specific weight of a person who loves someone and believes love gives them the right to reshape that person's future. Then he reached the contract pages. There were 2. The first was the one Harry had expected, adjacent to his own, connected to the primary covenant, a secondary arrangement that identified Neville as an alternative candidate for the same prophecy-adjacent role Harry occupied. The architects had ensured their investment. If Harry failed or was removed from the equation, Neville would have been activated as the secondary party. It was a coverage policy on a very large bet. The second contract was what Harry hadn't expected. It was different in character from the first, not an architect contract at all, but a private arrangement, brokered outside the main covenant, between a party Harry recognized immediately, Dumbledore's signature, the cramped blue ink, and a second party whose name he didn't recognize, W. Longbottom. An initial and a surname. A family member. Harry stared at it. The arrangement was this: in exchange for the Longbottom family's cooperation with certain strategic decisions regarding Neville's placement and development, and in exchange for the suppression of specific information about the nature of the Longbottom's condition, which this contract referred to not as the generally known story but by a different phrase, event-induced magical feedback overload, the Dumbledore party agreed to provide annual financial support to the grandmother's estate and to ensure Neville remained in Gryffindor House regardless of the Sorting Hat's independent assessment. Harry read that last part twice. The Hat had wanted to put Neville somewhere else. And Dumbledore had intervened. And the grandmother had agreed, in exchange for money and information management about what had really happened to Frank and Alice Longbottom. He closed the book. He sat in the archive for a moment, which he rarely did. He was usually a reader and a leaver, in and out, but he sat now and looked at the rows and rows of ledgers and thought about the architecture of it. The scale. Not a single transaction but a whole system, interlocking, each piece supporting the others, each arrangement creating a new dependency, a new leverage point, a new person whose cooperation was purchased and whose knowledge was managed. It wasn't that Dumbledore was a villain. It was that Dumbledore was a builder. He'd built a structure the way you build a load-bearing wall, each piece necessary to the whole, each compromise made to hold something else up, each managed person a structural element. Pull one piece out and others were affected. Which was why he was so careful. Which was why the annotations were so thorough. Which was why he'd come to Harry's dormitory door on the second night and stood there for 30 seconds, Harry had heard the footsteps, had feigned sleep, and then gone away again without knocking, the decision made and then unmade. Harry replaced Neville's book and stood and walked out of the archive and back into the alcove and stood for a moment in the low afternoon light filtering through the common room windows. He needed to tell Neville. Not all of it, not yet, not with the hearing not yet scheduled, not with the full picture not yet verified. But enough. Enough that Neville wasn't the last person in his own story to understand what had been done. He found Neville in the greenhouse. Not a Hogwarts greenhouse, those were Professor Sprout's domain and locked on weekends. There was a small glassed area off the east wing that was technically a maintenance space but had, in the unoccupied corner behind the gardening equipment, a patch of soil where someone had clearly been growing things unofficially. Harry had noticed it on his architectural survey of the school's exterior and had not mentioned it to anyone. Neville was there, crouched over the soil with his sleeves rolled up, tending something small and green with the complete absorbed attention of someone doing the only thing they were certain they were good at. He didn't hear Harry come in. Harry sat down on an old wooden crate near the door and waited. After 2 minutes Neville sensed him and startled badly. "It's just me," Harry said. I know. Neville took a breath. "I'm not, you won't tell Filch." "I don't care about Filch," Harry said. "What are you growing?" Neville looked at his patch of soil with the expression of someone choosing between vulnerability and evasion, and chose vulnerability, probably because it was Harry and Harry had already been sitting there calmly for 2 minutes like he belonged. "Mimbulus Mimbletonia," he said. "Or trying to. It's tropical and the temperature's wrong here but I thought if he made a gesture at a small setup of warming charms on the edge of the patch, kept the microclimate warm enough it might establish." Harry looked at the warming charms. They were correct and efficiently arranged. "That's good work," he said. "Gran said I should focus on my school subjects. You're in a greenhouse tending to a rare tropical plant on a Saturday afternoon instead. What does that tell you about what you should focus on?" Neville looked at him. Then at his plant. "It's just a hobby. It's the thing you're most naturally talented at and the thing you return to when you don't have to perform for anyone," Harry said. "That's not a hobby. That's a vocation." He paused. "Neville. I need to tell you something and I want you to know before I start that what I'm going to tell you doesn't define what you're worth or what you're capable of. It's just information. All right?" Neville went still in the way of someone who has been braced for difficult information their whole life and has developed a very efficient process for receiving it. "All right," he said. "There's a contract that affects you," Harry said. "Similar to one that affects me. You were identified before your first year as an alternative, a contingency, in a larger magical arrangement that was made without your knowledge or consent. The contract doesn't require anything of you right now. But it exists, and you should know it exists." A long silence. Outside, the wind moved across the east wing's glass and the afternoon light shifted. "Who made it?" Neville asked. "Dumbledore," Harry said. For reasons that were, he thought about the word, structural. "Not personal." "Not personal," Neville repeated, with a flatness that said he understood exactly what structural meant for the person who was the structure. "No." Harry met his eyes. "And there's a second arrangement. Between Dumbledore and someone in your family, I believe your grandmother. About your parents. About what happened to them." The stillness in Neville changed quality. "What about what happened to them?" "I don't have the full picture yet," Harry said, honestly. "What I have is evidence that the publicly available account of their condition isn't the complete account, and that someone negotiated to keep it that way. I don't know yet whether the incomplete account is significantly different from the full one. I need more access to verify." Neville was looking at the Mimbulus Mimbletonia, not at Harry. His hands were very still in his lap. "Are they?" he started. Stopped. Started again. "Are they going to get better?" "I don't know," Harry said. "Honestly, I don't know yet. I'm working toward understanding it." Another long silence. When Neville looked up his eyes were wet but his jaw was set, and the expression on his face had something in it that hadn't been there before, not the compressed uncertainty, not the bracing for disaster. Something harder than that. Something that had been looking for something to push back against for 11 years and had just been given a specific target. "What are you doing?" Neville asked. "About all of this. The contracts." "Building a case," Harry said. "For a legal challenge before the entities who brokered the original contracts. It takes time and specific preparation, but it's possible. 2 precedents in the last 600 years of successful challenges." 2, Neville said, dry. 2 is more than 0, Harry said. And those 2 cases didn't have the documentary foundation we're building. Or the specific material breach grounds. He paused. "I want to include your contract in the challenge. If you want that. But it has to be your choice." Neville looked at him for a long time. Harry let the look run its full length, didn't rush it, didn't add anything to it. "Yes," Neville said, eventually. Simply. "Yes." Harry nodded. "I'll need you to sign a witness attestation to the second contract, the private arrangement about your parents. It strengthens the material breach argument to have a directly affected party on record." He paused. "I'll explain what that means legally before I ask you to sign anything." "I know what a witness attestation is," Neville said, with a small, slightly surprised dignity. "Gran taught me about legal documents. She's very thorough." Harry smiled. "Of course she is." Neville looked at his plant again. Reached out and adjusted something in the warming charm arrangement with a small, precise movement. The plant seemed, marginally, to stand straighter. "Does Hermione know all of this?" "Most of it. She's scary when she's focused on something," Neville said, which was not quite the observation Harry had expected but which was also completely accurate. "Deeply," Harry agreed. "Good," said Neville, and for the first time in their acquaintance, the word came out with something that was not performance or brace or anxiety but just, certainty. "Pure and clean as a note struck correctly. Then I think we'll be all right." 3 days after the Anchor Chamber visit, the response came. Harry was in defense against the dark arts, watching Quirrell deliver a lesson on basic shielding charms with the increasingly transparent performance of a man whose real attention was elsewhere, when a note appeared on his desk. Not owl post, this note had arrived through the air itself, materializing from nothing with the quality of the sourceless light he knew from the archives chambers. The parchment was the silver-edged material, cool to the touch, covered in the shifting script that resolved in peripheral vision. He tilted his head. "Read it. Primary party access event registered. Notification principal engaged. The Covenant acknowledges the formal initiation of challenge proceedings. The primary party is invited to submit a position statement within the notification period. The Covenant further notes the registered grounds of material breach and advises all interested parties of their right to respond. A hearing date will be provided upon receipt of all position statements." Below the formal text, in the script that required peripheral vision to read, a single line, "The registrar acknowledges that the contract on record has been managed in ways that warrant examination." Harry read that last line 3 times. It was the architects telling him something without telling him that they had already looked at the breach grounds and found them substantive enough to acknowledge. Not a ruling. But a signal. He folded the note, put it in his pocket, and looked up. Quirrell had stopped mid-sentence and was staring at the space where the note had materialized. His face had the quality of someone who had seen this kind of magic before and recognized it, and the recognition had made the stammer disappear entirely for 3 full seconds before he recovered it. Harry watched him recover it. Watched the eyes that were slightly too sharp under the nervous performance, the intelligence that was slightly too concentrated for the figure presenting it. He filed it. He'd had a suspicion about Quirrell since the first week, and this had added a layer of confirmation he hadn't had before. The note burning quietly in his pocket, the hearing coming, the clock running, Harry turned back to the lesson and raised his hand when Quirrell asked about shielding charm theory, and gave the correct answer clearly and without rush, and in his peripheral vision the shifting script of the architect's acknowledgement glowed silver and steady against the dark fabric of his robe. Chapter 4, The names in the ledger. The position statement took 11 days to write. Not because Harry didn't know what to say, he'd been drafting it in his head for 4 years, assembling the argument the way you assemble a structure, piece by piece, checking the load-bearing points, testing the connections. The 11 days were for precision. The architects dealt in language the way architects dealt in stone, every word placed with intent, every clause capable of bearing weight. He wasn't going to hand them something that could be read 2 ways. He wrote it in the back of his journal, the one he'd bought at the stationer's in Diagon Alley, in the clean careful handwriting he'd developed at Privet Drive Primary when he'd understood that handwriting was the first thing teachers used to assess whether you were worth taking seriously. He showed it to Hermione on the 3rd day. She read it without speaking, made 4 margin notes, handed it back. He incorporated 2 of the 4, explained why he wasn't incorporating the 3rd, and they agreed to disagree about the 4th, which involved a point of covenant law interpretation that was genuinely ambiguous and which he decided to include in his version because the ambiguity, resolved in his favor, produced a stronger position. If they resolve it against you, it weakens the argument, Hermione said. If I don't include it, I leave a gap they can fill with their own interpretation, Harry said. I'd rather frame the ambiguity myself. She thought about it. Fine. But footnote it. Acknowledge the alternative reading and distinguish it. Don't pretend the ambiguity doesn't exist. Agreed. He added the footnote. On the 11th day he transcribed the final version onto a clean sheet of parchment, signed it, and held it in both hands and thought clearly, this is my formal position statement, submitted to the full covenant in the matter of the contract on Harry James Potter, in challenge proceedings initiated on the basis of material breach. He felt the archive receive it, the same cool, attentive quality he'd felt since he was 7, the sense of something vast and mechanical acknowledging a transaction, and then the parchment was gone. Done, he said. Hermione let out a breath. How long until they set a date? The text says upon receipt of all position statements. Dumbledore has to submit one too. And the architects need to complete their internal review. Harry looked at the window. November light, thin and grey, the ground's frost-touched this week. I'd estimate a month. Maybe 6 weeks. Before Christmas, Hermione said. Probably. She nodded. Filed it. Moved on in the way she did, the way Harry had come to rely on, never performing anxiety, never manufacturing urgency, just addressing what was in front of her with the same focused attention she gave everything. He'd thought about that a lot in the 11 days of drafting. About how much of what he'd built in these months had been built alone, in the abstract, in planning, and how different the actual building felt when there was someone beside you who understood the blueprints without requiring them to be explained. He didn't say that. Some things were better filed than spoken. But he filed it with care. Quidditch tryouts were on a Thursday, which Harry had known about and had been mildly interested in for reasons both practical and otherwise. The practical reason was Oliver Wood, who had approached Harry after finding him practicing basic broom work in the courtyard during the first week, not performing, just getting familiar with a piece of equipment he intended to use, and had done the most Oliver Wood thing possible, which was to watch for 45 seconds with an expression of increasingly desperate hope and then say, "You're trying out for the team." "Am I?" Harry had said. "Yes," Wood said, with the certainty of a person for whom Quidditch was less a sport than a calling. "You're definitely trying out for the team." The otherwise reason was simpler. Harry was 11. He liked flying. He intended to do it in a formalized context where someone maintained brooms and set the rules. He made the team as seeker in 11 minutes. He found the snitch on his first search run. It was hiding behind the left goalpost, which was not, as he explained to Wood afterward, a hiding spot so much as a resting spot. The snitch had settled because the magnetic field generated by the goalpost's anchoring charm provided a mild heat it was attracted to, and if you knew to look for heat sources you could narrow a search considerably. Wood stared at him with the expression of a person experiencing religious feeling in the context of sports. "Say that again," Wood said. "Which part?" "All of it." Slowly. Harry explained the snitch behavior again, slightly more slowly. Wood wrote 2 pages of notes and did not notice he'd written 2 pages of notes. Harry suspected Wood had a beautiful, specific, slightly limited mind, and that within the territory of Quidditch it was genuinely extraordinary. "Your seeker," Wood said, unnecessarily, since this had been established. "First-year seeker." "We haven't had a first-year seeker since my father," Harry said. He'd read it in the archive sports annotation section, which was a small, cheerful subsection that existed in odd contrast to the rest of the archive's contents, fate threads connected to individual games and playing decisions, bets placed by minor deities on outcomes, one memorably annotated match from 1958 involving a particularly consequential injury. "I know." Wood looked at him with eyes that were simultaneously full of Quidditch strategy and something more human, and said, "Do you mind?" "That it's the same." "No," Harry said, and meant it. "I think it would have made him happy." Wood clapped him on the shoulder with the sincerity of someone who processes emotion through physical contact and sports achievement. "Right. Practice is Tuesday and Thursday. Don't be late." Harry was never late. He was always 4 minutes early because early gave you time to observe before the thing started, and observation was a habit that had never once let him down. It was at the 3rd Quidditch practice that the architects made their first appearance. Harry was 40 feet up, doing a long sweeping arc around the stadium's upper perimeter, Wood's drill for building search pattern discipline, which Harry had already optimized by the 2nd practice but ran faithfully because the rest of the team needed the repetition and he wasn't going to disrupt the session for his own convenience, when the air on the far side of the stadium changed. Changed wasn't the right word exactly. Thinned was better. The same way the archive's entrance thinned the wall of the cupboard, a depth appearing where depth wasn't architectural. 3 points, equally spaced along the eastern stand, where the November air became briefly transparent to something that was not the sky. 3 figures stood in the transparency. Not physically in the stadium, not people, not bodies, not anything he could describe in terms of size or appearance except that they were present in the way the archive was present, in the way the contract documents were present, with the weight of something that existed on a different register from the visible world but was no less real for it. Harry pulled his broom to a stop 40 feet up and looked directly at them. The registrar. The executor. The witness. He felt, very clearly, what it was to be seen by them, not the scene of social interaction, not even the scene of Dumbledore's careful attention. This was categorized. This was the experience of being read the way the archive's records were read, assessed and filed and cross-referenced against known data. It was not comfortable. It was not designed to be. He looked back with the same steadiness he'd given everything since he was 7. He thought, very clearly, I see you too. Below, the team ran their passing drills oblivious. Wood was shouting something about formation. 2 seagulls moved across the gray sky beyond the stadium, indifferent. The 3 figures observed him for approximately 40 seconds. Then the air knit itself back together and they were gone, and Harry descended to practice level and completed the remaining drills with his usual precision, and afterward, when the team was filing in for the locker room, he stayed on the pitch for an extra minute in the gathering dark. He'd known they would come and look. The acknowledgement letter had told him the Covenant was reviewing the breach grounds, which meant they were reviewing him, the primary party, the contracted subject, the 11-year-old who had formally challenged a Covenant arrangement that had been in place for over a decade. They wanted to take the measure of him. He hoped he'd given them something worth measuring. Hermione was waiting in the common room with the particular energy of someone who had been waiting with news for a non-trivial amount of time and was managing the waiting professionally. Neville found something, she said. Where is he? Alcove. She was already moving. The alcove off the common room had become their default space for anything that required privacy, Harry and Hermione and, now, Neville, who had joined the working group with a quiet commitment that reminded Harry of what it felt like to watch someone discover that they were allowed to have purposes beyond the ones assigned to them. He'd been steadily, visibly changing in the weeks since the greenhouse conversation. Not dramatically, not overnight. More like the Mimbulus Mimbletonia, establishing slowly in conditions that weren't quite right and then, once established, committed. Neville was in the alcove with a book, not a school text, a thin, very old volume with no title on its spine, the kind of thing that lived in family libraries. He looked up when Harry came in. "My gran keeps files," he said. "About everything. Legal correspondence, financial records, medical updates on," he stopped, "on my parents. She's always kept files. When I was 9 she showed me where the household files were kept and said I should know where things were in case something happened to her." "And you've been corresponding with her since you arrived," Harry said. "Since the second week. I asked her to send me the file on the private arrangement you told me about." He looked at the book. "It arrived this morning." "What's in it?" Neville opened the book to a tabbed section near the middle. "The arrangement was made when I was 3. My grandmother agreed to provide Dumbledore with access to specific Longbottom family knowledge. Ancient family magic. Protective enchantments from the Longbottom estate going back 400 years. He ran his finger along a line of text. "In exchange, Dumbledore provided financial support and arranged for information about my parents' condition to be," he found the word in the text and read it directly, "managed in the public record to reflect a version consistent with strategic necessity." "Managed in the public record," Harry said. "They were tortured," Neville said. "Not with distress, with the flat precision of someone saying something they've always known but have never said to anyone. I know the official story. I always knew the official story. Death Eaters. The Cruciatus Curse." He looked up. "The Real file says something different about the timeline. It says my parents were, it says they were targeted 2 weeks after Voldemort's fall. Not during the war. After. When it was already over." The alcove was very quiet. "After," Harry said. "After. And the people who attacked them were looking for information about a specific magical object that the Longbottom family had in their estate's protected collection. An object the file identifies as," he found the page, "a Covenant Anchor artifact of Longbottom family origin." Harry and Hermione looked at each other. "There was a second anchor," Harry said. "In the Longbottom estate," Hermione said, and Harry could see her pulling threads together with the speed of someone whose mind ran naturally in systems. "If the Longbottom family had an independent Covenant anchor, they had independent access to the architects," Harry said. "Their own relationship with the Covenant, separate from the main contract. Which means they were a wild card in the arrangement. They could have challenged the main contract independently if they'd chosen to." He looked at Neville. "And the people who attacked your parents were trying to retrieve the Longbottom artifact before they could use it." "Who sent them?" Neville said. A pause. "The file doesn't say. It says the identities were never officially established." Neville looked at the file with an expression that had more anger in it than Harry had ever seen from him, and the anger was clean and well-founded. "Gran said she always suspected it was someone who knew about the artifact's significance. Someone with enough authority to ensure the investigation stayed limited." Harry sat down on the bench. He thought about the performance bond. The guarantee of institutional authority. The guarantee that required the removal of any independent challenge to the Covenant arrangement. If the Longbottoms had possessed an independent artifact that could have been used to challenge the contract, they would have been a threat to the guarantee. Not a threat to Dumbledore personally, not necessarily, but a structural threat to the whole arrangement. "The file," Harry said. "Can I read it?" Neville handed it over. Harry read it in 10 minutes, thoroughly, noting the specific dates, the legal language in the arrangement document, the 3 signatures at the bottom of the private agreement. Dumbledore. W. Longbottom, Augusta. And a third signature he didn't recognize, in a hand that wasn't human, in a script that sat between the shifting architect script and ordinary writing. A third party. Someone who'd brokered the private arrangement between Dumbledore and Augusta Longbottom. Someone who'd had a foot in both the Covenant world and the human world. This third signature, Harry said. Neville leaned over to look. Gran never explained who that was. I asked in my letter. She said it was. He consulted a separate sheet of his grandmother's correspondence, her handwriting upright and decisive, an interested party who facilitated the arrangement and whose identity is not relevant to the terms. Not relevant to the terms, Harry repeated. Which means she knows who it is and doesn't want to put it in writing. Which means it's someone whose identity would change how we read the arrangement, Hermione said. Or someone whose identity would create additional complications if exposed. Harry looked at the signature. He'd learned to read the shifting script well enough by now to catch fragments in peripheral vision. The architect names were always titles, the registrar, the executor, the witness. This signature wasn't a title. It was something else. 3 syllables, in a script that was half shifting, half fixed. He tilted his head. Let his peripheral vision take it. The proxy. Not one of the 3 architects. A fourth entity, or not an entity, a role. Someone acting in the architect's capacity without being one of the 3. He sat with that. Filed it. Said nothing yet to Hermione and Neville because he needed to think about it more before he said it out loud. The artifact from the estate, he said instead. What happened to it? Neville's face did something careful. The file says it was moved to Hogwarts for safekeeping after my parents were hospitalized. Gran agreed to its transfer as part of the arrangement. She thought it would be protected here. He stopped. She thought it would be protected here. The thing in the 3rd-floor corridor. The thing Harry had clocked in his first week as something recent, deliberately placed, not part of the castle's original architecture. Something that had been brought here and secured with very serious protections. Neville, Harry said. When did your grandmother transfer it? Neville checked the file's date. Summer before this year. This past summer, Harry said. Within the last 6 months. Yes. Which meant it had been placed here in preparation for this year. In preparation for Harry's arrival. Which meant Dumbledore had known Harry was coming, had anticipated that the contract situation might become active, had gathered every piece of architecture with leverage over the arrangement and placed it within the one location he controlled absolutely. He was consolidating. That was what the 3rd-floor corridor was. A consolidation of assets. Harry looked at Hermione. I need to add a supplementary statement to my position, he said. Before the date is set. On what grounds, she said. The Longbottom artifact is material to the hearing. It's an independent covenant anchor that was removed from its rightful custodian's possession under a coercive arrangement and relocated without transparent disclosure of the reason. He paused. If I can establish that it's being held here to disadvantage the challenge proceedings, the architects will require its production as evidence in the hearing. Can you establish that? The file establishes that the artifact has covenant significance. The timing of its transfer, this summer, this year, when the challenge proceedings were clearly anticipated, establishes proximity to the proceedings. It's circumstantial but it's substantive circumstantial. He looked at Neville. I need to include your name in the supplementary statement as a directly affected custodial party. Include it, Neville said. I will. And, Harry hesitated, not from uncertainty but because the next part required care. Neville. The artifact your family had. In the Archive's Covenant records, there are secondary contract documents adjacent to yours. One of them is the coverage policy I mentioned, the contingency arrangement. But there's a note in the Archive's margin of that record indicating that the Longbottom family's independent covenant access predated the main contract by 2 generations. Your great-grandfather negotiated a separate relationship with the covenant in the 1920s. What kind of relationship? I don't have the full text. But the margin note describes it as an observer status agreement, which in covenant law means a party who has the right to attend covenant hearings without being bound by the architect's decisions. Harry looked at him. If that agreement is still active, if it survived the private arrangement with Dumbledore, which it may have because agreements of that standing can only be terminated by the contracting party's formal renunciation, then you have the right to attend the hearing as a non-bound observer. The significance of this registered on Neville's face in stages. I can be there, he said. You can be there. Not as a party to the challenge. As someone the architects have a separate obligation to acknowledge. Which means even if Dumbledore tried to exclude you from the proceedings, he couldn't, Neville said. Not without the architects overruling their own historical agreement. Harry smiled. Which they won't. Neville looked at the old family file on his knees. At his grandmother's handwriting on the correspondence sheet. At the thin book that had arrived this morning from an estate in Devon, carrying 70 years of carefully maintained records, his grandmother's thorough, decisive hand evident in every indexed page. She kept everything, Neville said. Every piece of paper. I used to think it was just, she's like that about everything, about household accounts, about correspondence. I thought it was just how she was. He turned a page in the file. But she kept these specifically. She indexed them separately from the household files. She showed me the household files when I was 9, but she didn't show me these. She was protecting them, Harry said. Not hiding them. There's a difference. She was waiting, Neville said. I think she was waiting until I was ready to read them. He looked up. Do you think she knew that this year would be when it started? Harry thought about Augusta Longbottom, formidable, precise, a woman who had kept 70 years of legal files and raised her grandson with the weight of expectation and the tools of a thorough mind, and who had, when asked, sent the relevant file to Hogwarts without hesitation, as if she'd had it ready. I think, Harry said, your grandmother is an extraordinary woman and I would very much like to meet her. A small, surprised smile moved across Neville's face. She would terrify you, he said. Good, Harry said. I'll be ready for it. The supplementary statement went out the next day. The response from the architects arrived at dinner, another note in the sourceless light materializing beside Harry's plate, the shifting script cool against his fingers. He tilted his head, read it, and felt something that was close to satisfaction but more precise than that. The particular feeling of a move that lands exactly where you aimed it. The Covenant acknowledges receipt of supplementary position statement. The artifact of Longbottom family origin is hereby designated as material evidence in the pending proceedings and is subject to Covenant preservation requirements from this date. Neither the current custodian nor any interested party may alter, remove, or access the artifact pending the conclusion of the hearing. Hermione read the note over his shoulder. That means Dumbledore can't move it, she said quietly. And can't access it, Harry said. Whatever's in the third-floor corridor, he can't use it and can't relocate it. The architects have frozen it. He's going to know that came from us. He already knows everything comes from us, Harry said. That's fine. He looked down the Gryffindor table, where Neville was eating with the same quiet steadiness he'd been bringing to everything since the greenhouse, the compressed uncertainty restructured into something that looked very much like purpose. It's fine, Harry said again. He folded the note and put it away and ate his dinner. Across the hall, at the staff table, Dumbledore was not eating. He was sitting with his fork in his hand and his plate untouched and his eyes somewhere that was not the Great Hall, with the expression of a man working through a complex calculation whose variables had recently changed without warning. Not panicked, Dumbledore didn't do panic, or if he did it was inaccessible under the layers of equanimity and experience. But recalculating. Snape, to Dumbledore's left, was eating with the focused efficiency of someone who knew something was happening and was deliberately not looking at the thing that was happening, which was itself a kind of looking. Harry ate his shepherd's pie and thought about the proxy. He'd gone into the archive the previous night to look, and found, as he'd half expected, that the proxy's signature appeared in 3 places in the covenant records beyond the Longbottom arrangement. Once in a record from the 1940s, once in a record from 1970, and once in a record from 1981, which was the year of Harry's birth and the year of his parents' death and the year the main contract had been established. The proxy had been present at all 3. The 1940s record was indistinct, he couldn't read the full text without more time, but the 1970 record was the one that had kept him awake. It was a contract for the training and development of a specific magical talent, the secondary party identified only by initials, STP. He hadn't figured out STP yet. He was working on it. The 1981 record, the one from the year of the contract, contained the proxy's signature in a notarial capacity, as a witness to the transaction, not a party to it. But a witness who was present for the signing of the contract had, under covenant law, a specific obligation, to attest to the full and free consent of all parties. If the primary party, Harry, had been unable to consent due to age, the witness was required to formally note the age limitation and its implications for the contract's validity. The proxy's attestation noted the age limitation. And then noted, in the shifting script that was hardest to read, something that amounted to, the contracting parties have agreed that this limitation will be addressed by the establishment of a guardian consent mechanism. The guardian consent mechanism was Dumbledore's signature in a custodial capacity. Which meant the entire contract's validity rested on Dumbledore's consent being adequate substitute for Harry's own. Which meant if Dumbledore's custodial conduct was found to be in material breach of his custodial obligations, the whole contract was voidable. Not just challenged. Voidable at the root. He'd found this at 2 in the morning and had sat in the archive for 5 additional minutes, which was longer than usual, because this was the kind of discovery that required sitting with it. He'd been building arguments for the breach, for the subclauses, for the specific violations. He hadn't seen, until last night, that all of them pointed back to a single architectural point, the custodial consent. If Dumbledore had failed as custodian, he'd failed not just as contract manager but as the structural basis on which the whole contract stood. He was going to need to find the proxy. Or the proxy's identity. Because if the proxy had attested to the custodial consent mechanism, they were a witness to the conditions that had been violated, and their testimony before the full covenant would be decisive. The question of STP suddenly became considerably more urgent. 3 days later Hermione sat bolt upright at the library table. Harry was across from her reading the 1920s covenant law precedents, looking for other observer status agreements and their terms. Neville was to his left, with the herbology text that he'd stopped reading upside down, the devil's snare page covered in his own small annotations. It was a Saturday, mid-afternoon, thin light through the library's high windows, Madame Pants circling the stacks with the territorial precision of a woman who regarded books as dependents in her care. Hermione sat bolt upright and said, quietly but with a controlled urgency, STP. Harry looked up. Sears' Theoretical Practice, she said, and pushed a book across the table. It was one of the historical texts from the Covenant Law subsection, a broad survey of 20th-century covenant transactions, which she'd been working through systematically. She had it open to a page in the 1970s section, her finger on a paragraph. A specific practitioner development program offered by the Covenant in the 1970s to wizards and witches demonstrating prophetic ability. The proxy oversaw it directly. STP isn't initials for a person, it's an abbreviation for the program. Harry read the paragraph. Sears' Theoretical Practice, a closed enrollment curriculum administered under direct covenant authority, designed to develop and refine raw prophetic ability in candidates identified by the registrar's preliminary survey. Enrollment, 1970 to 1979. Participants, undisclosed due to covenant privacy provisions. The proxy ran a seer development program, Harry said. For 10 years. And then in 1980, one of those seers, she turned 2 pages, made a prophecy. The text doesn't specify what the prophecy was. It says a prophecy was registered in the covenant records in 1980 that materially influenced the subsequent transaction of 1981. The prophecy. Harry sat back. He'd known there was a prophecy, the archive's records had referenced it obliquely, in the margins of the main contract, as a contextual factor. He'd assumed it was a separate piece of information, disconnected from the Covenant machinery. He'd been wrong. The prophecy wasn't external to the contract, he said. It was generated inside the Covenant's own training program, Hermione said. The architects trained the seer. The seer made the prophecy. The prophecy became the basis for the 1981 contract. She looked at him with the expression of someone who has just seen the entire architecture of something from the outside. The architects manufactured the conditions for the prophecy. They didn't just respond to it. They created the circumstances that produced it. Which means, Harry said slowly, the prophecy that justified the contract was generated by the same entities who then used it to broker the contract. Self-referential, Neville said quietly. Both Harry and Hermione looked at him. He was looking at the page Hermione had indicated, reading it in the focused, careful way he read things when he intended to understand them completely. He thought about it, like telling someone that their house will burn down, selling them insurance, and then setting the fire. That's exactly what it's like, Harry said. The library was quiet around them. Madame Pants rounded a distant stack's corner. Outside, a gust of November wind hit the windows. Harry was thinking very carefully because this was the moment where the shape of the case changed substantially, not in a way that weakened it, in a way that made it much larger than he'd originally conceived. The architects have a conflict of interest, he said. They created the conditions for the prophecy that justified the contract they then brokered and profited from. They're not impartial arbiters of this hearing. They're parties to the conduct being challenged. But they're the only court, Hermione said. They're the Covenant. There's no external body to challenge them in. Not for the main contract, no. But, Harry paused, pulled at something in the back of his memory, a reference from the dissolution text he'd read months ago, a footnote he'd filed without understanding its full significance at the time. There's a provision. In the oldest layer of Covenant law. A provision for what the text calls fundamental conflict. When the arbiters of a Covenant proceeding are found to have a direct interest in the outcome, any party to the proceedings can invoke, he was moving through his memory carefully, can invoke the equitable witness protocol. Which requires the architects to recuse themselves from the role of judges and appoint an independent adjudicator. Who would the independent adjudicator be? Neville asked. The protocol doesn't specify a person or entity. It specifies a method. The proxy, if there is one of record in the relevant proceedings, serves as interim adjudicator. Because the proxy is bound to both the Covenant and the affected parties, they're considered the most neutral available. He stopped. The three of them looked at each other. The proxy has to adjudicate their own case, Hermione said. Effectively. They're not one of the three architects. They're not a direct party to the main contract. They witnessed the signing. They ran the seer program. They brokered the Longbottom arrangement. Harry's voice was still even, but there was something underneath it that was moving quickly. Under the equitable witness protocol, if I invoke the conflict of interest, the proxy becomes the adjudicator. Which means I need to find them before the hearing date. To do what? Neville said. To understand whose side they're on, Harry said. Because everything I've found in the record suggests the proxy isn't a neutral party. They have a history with this contract that goes beyond their official witness role. They agreed to the Longbottom arrangement, they signed it. Which means they've been managing multiple threads of this situation for decades, and they have a stake in how it resolves. He paused. I need to know if that stake is aligned with the challenge or against it. How do you find them? Hermione said. The 1981 record, Harry said. The one where the proxy witnessed the signing. The proxy's signature is partially legible in peripheral vision. I've been trying to resolve it fully. If I go back to the archive tonight and spend more time, I'm coming, Hermione said. And me, said Neville. Harry looked at them both. Then nodded. They went in at 11, through the alcove, Neville's first time in the archive. He'd been told about it in detail, but the telling hadn't prepared him for the reality of standing in a library with no ceiling, surrounded by the history of every soul whose fate had been formalized by the Covenant, the sourceless light making his face look like someone who had stepped into a place that confirmed rather than created what he'd already believed. "It's real," he said, quietly, not to anyone. "It's real," Harry agreed. He led them to the Covenant records and found the 1981 record. Pulled it from the shelf. Laid it on the glass floor, the figures moving beneath them, slow and purposeful, and crouched over it with Hermione beside him. The proxy's signature. 3 syllables in the half-shifting script. He'd gotten the first syllable clearly in earlier attempts, Vel, the second was harder. He tilted his head, let his peripheral vision engage, held the focus not on the signature itself but on the space around it, using the contrast between the fixed and the shifting elements to resolve the boundary. "Vel, Thris," he said quietly, and then the third syllable locked in with the specific clarity of something that's been at the edge of resolution for weeks, and he said the full name. Beside him, Hermione inhaled. Neville said nothing for a moment. Then, "What does that mean?" Harry looked up from the record. He was thinking about the portrait in the headmaster's office, the one in the far left corner that he'd noticed on his visit to Dumbledore 2 weeks ago, the portrait that was not of a Hogwarts headmaster and whose subject had been turned away from the room, facing the painted wall behind them, in the deliberate posture of something that didn't want to be seen. He'd noticed it and filed it and not yet returned to it. He returned to it now. A portrait in Dumbledore's office of a non-headmaster entity. Turned to the wall. After a meeting in which Dumbledore had recalibrated his approach and said nothing further of consequence, but the portrait had been there the whole time. Present. Turned away. "It means," Harry said carefully, "that the proxy has been in Hogwarts this whole time." The archive hummed around them. "Where?" Hermione said. Harry stood up. Replaced the record on its shelf. Looked at the rows of ledgers and the sourceless light and the glass floor and the figures below it. "Somewhere they don't have to be seen," he said. "Somewhere they can observe without being implicated. Somewhere Dumbledore could keep an eye on them while also keeping them." He thought about the portrait turned to the wall, quiet. Hermione was very still. "The portrait in the headmaster's office," she said. "Yes." "The one facing away." "Yes." She thought about it. "You need access to that office to talk to it." "I need access to that office," Harry said, "and I need the portrait to want to turn around." He paused. "Which means I need to give it something worth turning around for." "Like what?" Neville asked. "Like its name," Harry said. "I've just said its name, here, in the archive, where everything is heard and recorded. The record will show I've found it. The proxy will know." He looked at the shelf where the 1981 record sat. "The question is whether it decides to meet me, or whether Dumbledore gets to it first." They were quiet for a moment. "Then we should move quickly," Hermione said. "Tomorrow," Harry said. "I'll go to Dumbledore's office tomorrow." "On what pretext?" Harry thought about it. "On the pretext of having questions about my parents," he said. Which is a pretext so obvious and so emotionally legitimate that refusing it would be itself informative. "He won't refuse it," Hermione said. "He can't refuse it without it looking like exactly what it is." "No," Harry agreed. "He can't." He took one more look around the archive, the rows of ledgers, the light, the living record of every transaction the Covenant had ever made, and felt the particular quality of a moment just before something changes irreversibly. Not anxiety. Something closer to readiness. The feeling of standing at the start of a run you've been training for. He led them out of the archive, through the alcove, into the common room where the fire had burned low and the room was empty in the way of 2 in the morning, and they parted at the dormitory stairs, and Harry lay in his bed and looked at the dark above him and thought not about the strategy or the hearing or the proxy or the conflict of interest, but about the feeling of Neville's face when he'd said "it's real," The confirmation of something he'd already believed, the moment when a person discovers that the world is exactly as serious as they suspected. He thought, we're going to do this. Not with the tentative hope of someone who wanted something. With the settled certainty of someone who had been building toward it since they were 7 years old in a dark cupboard and had just, in the last week, started to see the full architecture of what they'd been building toward all along. He closed his eyes. Outside, the November wind moved across Hogwarts, and the castle breathed its long slow breath, and somewhere in the headmaster's office, in the far left corner, a portrait sat with its back to the room. And, very slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to turn around.